Okay, well, welcome everyone. Appreciate you attending our program today, Avoiding Regulatory Trouble and Responding to Government Inquiries. This will be an anti-fraud update for FDA regulated manufacturers, so drug and device companies. Again, thank you for participating. We will be recording this session, so the slides will be available. If there's anything you'd like to follow up on today, please feel free to reach out to myself, Dulcie, or Amanda Johnston. This program was hatched by Dulcie and I last summer on a patio on Lake Minnetonka. A little bit different than today. We have a kind of a gray day here in Minnesota, but we wish we were all in person, perhaps down at Fredrikson and Byron, in Minneapolis, but we're virtual, which is fine. But yeah, we certainly miss seeing all of you in person. But hopefully the next program maybe we'll do one in the spring. I know that Gardner Law is currently looking at a program in Utah again, perhaps at Snowbird. So hopefully we can get back together in person soon. To give just a quick overview of the program today, if you want to go to the next slide. Here's our agenda. So we will discuss, Dulcie and I will discuss recent FDA, AKS, and FCA cases. And sorry for all the acronyms. We'll try and spell things out for you as we go along. I think everyone knows what FDA means. Anti-kickback statute is AKS, and FCA is False Claims Act. So Dulcie and I will cover those cases. We'll then turn it over to two speakers, one from drug, one from device, Brent and Sarah. They run respectively legal and compliance in their companies, and give their reaction to these recent cases and the OIG fraud alert guidance, which Dulcie and I will also cover. We'll have a short break. Please feel free to come in and out as you wish throughout the day, schedule permitting. We'll then have Amanda Johnston talk about deploying a compliance program, performing investigations. Sandra Cito will discuss managing compliance, kind of a day in the life, if you will, of Chief Compliance Officer. We'll have another quick break. Then Dulcie will cover responding to a government investigation, so that white collar perspective. And then we'll wrap things up with a discussion with Ann Miller from Medtronic. Amanda will be asking her some questions on recent FDA enforcement. So I'll hand it over to Mary Heath. She will be our moderator throughout the day. She's an attorney at Fredrikson and Byron in the health law practice, where she focuses on health law and has various industry clients, including pharmacies, manufacturers, others as well. Mary, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks, Mark. All right, before we dive into the content today, I get the privilege of going over housekeeping items. So if you're unable to stick with us for the full program, it's not a problem. We're recording, and you'll receive an email once that recording is available. For those of you who are interested in continuing education credits, this webinar has been approved for 3.5 standard CLE credits in the state of Minnesota. And people attending live, so not those watching on the recording, will receive an email with the CE details in the next couple of days. So as time allows, as we go through the sessions, we are going to incorporate Q&As at the end of each session. So we won't be interrupting the speakers, just an FYI. If you'd like to submit the questions, send them through the Q&A function that's at the bottom of your screen. You can also use that if you have any technological issues and you need to reach out and let us know. All right, so with that, I'm going to move on to our first session. Recent FDA, AKS, and FCA cases led by Mark Gardner and Dulcie Foster. So Mark, who we just heard from, is the directing attorney at Gardner Law and has spent the last 22 years working in the healthcare industry, advising companies on topics like healthcare compliance, advertising and promotion review, FDA regulatory, quality, and clinical matters, and a whole slew of more. He's an adjunct professor of law at Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law, where he teaches drug and device law. And he's also on the Mitchell-Hamlin School of Law Health Law Institute Advisory Board, which I did practicing in the mirror a few times. Dulcie is a shareholder at Fredrikson and Byron, where she's the co-chair of the White Collar and Regulatory Defense Group. She has spent 21 years in FCA and healthcare fraud litigation, focusing on criminal and civil regulatory matters involving alleged financial fraud, embezzlement, healthcare fraud, FCA violations, FCPA violations, trade secrets theft, and other compliance concerns. She was also a former clerk to Chief Judge John R. Thunheim. So Mark and Dulcie, I'll turn things over to you.
Thank you very much. We can go to the next slide. So Dulcie and I will just, we'll be covering a bunch of cases. We tried to curate some cases that are relevant and span anti-fraud, False Claims Act. We'll talk about these laws a little bit more as we describe the cases. The Sunshine Act, which I think everyone's familiar with, and the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. And then we'll talk about the OIG speaker fraud alert. Dulcie, if you want to say hi to the folks and anything
Good morning.
Yeah. So we'll be kind of just going over these cases together. So Dulcie, as we talked about, please interrupt me. I'll take a laboring oar on kind of briefing these cases, if you will, as we talked about, and please jump in anytime you like.
I will do that. Thank you, Mark.
Great. All right, next slide. So these are the trends. Literally we could have had one slide today and talked about the topics on here for the next, 50 minutes that we have until we turn things over to Sarah and Brent. But, this is an important slide for everyone just to get a sense of what's going on out there. We appreciate that you're all very busy and it's hard to keep up on all the cases, the government guidance, things that are coming at you. But these are 2021 trends. I think Dulcie would agree with me that, we expect these trends to continue. So the types of cases that should be on your radar: anti-kickback relating to bribery, the False Claims Act cases. If you violate the AKS, you're violating the FCA. The White House is sent a signal, hey, we're prosecuting what we see as fraud and abuse, spanning all industries, but healthcare has always been a focus, of course. Just the sheer amount of dollars at stake in the federal budget related to healthcare is huge. So they will continue to focus on that. The Trump administration focused on that, and the Obama administration before it. FDA cases, we'll kind of unpack that for you a bit. Sunshine and privacy. These are the trends. These are where the cases are. You can see under anti-kickback, we have a bunch of sub bullets there. Free marketing programs, always something to be mindful of, your sales and marketing folks, and transfers of value that could be construed as bribes, getting to practitioners to induce purchases. And we have a litany of other things there under the anti-kickback, which you can take a look at. The FDA theory is newer. The first case that we're going to talk about in a minute is an FDA case, and we'll dive into that. Dulcie, I'll just kind of pause for a moment. Anything you'd like to add here?
I'm not at that point. I'd like to just dive into the cases and talk about them. I think we've got a limited amount of time here, and it'd be nice to cover as much as we can.
Sounds great. Let's jump into the first case here. Next slide, please. So this is the Alere case. This is an FDA related case. Just to kind of construe the basics of the theory here, the government's approach to this case is they're alleging that Alere manufactured this in ratio product, which is designed to determine how fast your blood is coagulating. They said that they knew that it was being manufactured with some issues from July 19, 2008 through July of 2016. So for, quite a span there of 8 years. And they ultimately didn't address the issues and didn't tell users that the product had an issue with a defect that could impact its ability to do its job. And so the government, is at the end of the transaction paying for the devices and says, hey, we're not supposed to be paying for these things when you knew they were defective and we are ultimately harmed here. And your failure to do a recall, to correct the issue, and to ultimately make a business decision, as you can see in a sub bullet here, we take issue with that, and we are going to punish you. So this ended in a nearly $39 million False Claims Act settlement. Again, FDCA, Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act violated, and purchases were induced by the company, their sales, whatnot, without notifying the government that there was an issue with the product. And so the government ultimately took issue with this. Dulcie, do you want to say a few words just about the FCA and the construction here?
Yeah, so I think that what's interesting about the Allaire case, and this, what I think are seeing as a growing trend in some of these quality cases being brought, is that, historically, at least, over the past 10 years or so, there's been a lot more FDA off-label enforcement along with the anti-kickback statute, which is really kind of a contorted legal theory that the government's bringing, because doctors, as we all know, can legally prescribe off-label unless there's a national coverage decision or some other local coverage decision or some other guidance that says otherwise. Off-label prescription and Medicare coverage for those prescriptions is authorized. As we've got some recent Ninth Circuit decisions confirming that the off-label status of the usage of a device or a drug doesn't dictate whether or not there's Medicare coverage for it. And so to bring a False Claims Act case based on the off-label usage of it, it has to be joined up with an anti-kickback case or something to try to show that there is some sort of fraud on the federal fisc, that the federal monies were paid when they shouldn't have been. And so ultimately, I think the traditional kind of off-label False Claims Act cases that we've seen have been a conflation with anti-kickback cases, where the whistleblowers of the government has alleged that companies pay kickbacks to promote off-label uses, and then the FCA liability derives from that. Here we're seeing a trend, I think, of more cases being brought based on defective products. And that to me is much more, it actually makes more intuitive sense that defective products would be at issue, because that's kind of the traditional, that's what the FCA was grounded in. This was a statute that originated during the Civil War, when suppliers were supplying defective military equipment to the soldiers in the war. And the government decided to enact the False Claims Act to combat the use of or the selling of defective products to the government. And so these quality-based False Claims Act cases really, to me, feel like the government's kind of going back to its roots. It's a more direct and simple theory of liability, that if you recklessly supply defective goods and the government pays for them, then that's a false claim.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I'd also point out, the fines for violating the False Claims Act, 11,000, and this is, Dulcie, I know this is something by heart, given your practice, $11,000 per false claim, plus 3 times the amount of damages sustained by the federal government. I imagine that those fines rack up very quickly. In a case like this, where they're coming up with this $38.75 million, just a quick question, Dulcie, here. Did they ultimately go through and try and track how many violations occurred, or did they just kind of get a ballpark? We've of course seen some of these cases go into the billions of dollars. I'm just kind of curious your thoughts there.
Like how the damages get calculated?
Yes. Mm-hmm.
So there are multiple ways that the government can go about slicing that apple. Sometimes they'll look at the amount of profits that a company has garnered. And that is, in fact, the basis for, if there's a criminal case that arises for healthcare fraud, what they're looking at is in fact, going beyond the statutory criminal limits, but to the amount of gain, and then trebling that. In the False Claims Act context, what they will do is they will typically look at, instead of on a per claim basis, they will treble the damages. So they'll look at what the government paid. And there's some dispute that arises in some cases about whether it's, is it the total amount that the government paid for the product? They actually did get some product out of it, or is it just the amount that they paid more than they would have? In the anti-kickback context, it's pretty much the theory that's been accepted that the whole transaction is tainted. And so the damages are derived from the total amount that was paid for the product. And then depending on the amount of culpability that the government wants to assign to that, it can be up to treble that amount. There is this $11,000 per claim is kind of an alternative basis for calculating the amount of the penalties that will be paid. But frankly, what I've seen much more often is just this global look at what was the total amount paid and then a trebling of that, or in cases that are settled, sometimes maybe a doubling of that.
Okay, thank you. Just a couple of comments before we go to the next case here. I note that Abbott bought this company in 2017. Is kind of interesting. I wonder if they knew about this quality issue and just kind of factored that in. I know that we work with buyers and sellers on diligence a lot. Our practice is really transactionally focused, not litigation, like Dulcie's practice. But these, I'm kind of curious if Abbott ultimately had some idea about this issue. But at any rate, the last thing I kind of want to leave with the audience here, because we do, our team consists of people that worked, at companies like Medtronic and Abbott, for that matter, and others, and their quality and regulatory folks that are attorneys. So we deal with these questions a lot, like, do we have to do a recall? Can we close out this CAPA, et cetera? So here, just in the sub bullets, Alere received repeated warnings, including, and this is from the settlement agreement. They received multiple warnings, including from their own personnel, that InRatio's algorithm was flawed and could return discrepant results. In this next bullet, rather than pursue, and again, the government, I really think Dulcie probably is writing this or dictating a lot of this language in the settlement agreement. So perhaps we're not getting Alere's side of the story here as much, but I suspect rather than pursue further work to fix the problem, Alere acknowledged internally to make a, quote, business decision to close their CAPA, their corrective and preventative action investigation, without fixing the InRatio algorithm defect. So, we're a part of these business decisions. It's just, I think the trend here is to be really careful when looking at these quality issues, because they could have long-reaching impact. Here it's the settlement agreement also says that the product was linked to over a dozen deaths and 100 injuries. So just to be very careful with those decisions is my parting comment on this case. We can go to the next slide. Another FDA case. This one involves St. Jude and their ICDs and CRTDs. Hopefully the audience kind of appreciates what these products do, but they're used in the heart, and they're intended, for example, to detect and convert potentially fatal heart arrhythmias by delivering electronic shock to the heart. This technology has been around for some time. So we have a couple years here, 2014 to 2016. You'll notice a lot of these cases are, they're not like from this year. It's because it takes a long time for these cases to be litigated or settled. But with this one, it's a similar theory. The government saying you violated the False Claims Act because you knew of a defect, you didn't fix it, you should have told us, and we ended up paying for these products. In this case, the government contended specifically the following statement to the FDA was false and misleading. Again, this is from the pleadings in the case, actually the settlement agreement, my recollection. No serious injury, permanent harm, or deaths have been reported associated with this complaint. So that was the complaint that was filed to the FDA. The government took issue with that, because at the time they said there were actually 2 injuries and a death, and they should have corrected that statement. How did this case come to light? A patient who was implanted with the device 15 days after she was implanted the company issued a class 1 recall, which is the most serious type of recall, which, was class 1 is for devices where serious or adverse health consequences, including death, could occur. And she was upset. She had this device implanted and then later learned that she had to have it explanted, or was told that the device, the battery may die with no warning. So she filed the KETAM case, a complaint, which maybe Dulcie, if you don't mind, explain what the whistleblower provision, the KETAM provision, the False Claims Act, quick to the audience. That would be great.
Yeah, sure. For folks, I imagine a lot of folks, probably who are attending have already familiar with this, but for those who are not, the False Claims Act has two different pathways that can result in a case. One is the government just brings a direct claim and based on information that they have, that they believe they've been defrauded, and they file a case. The other route, and the more common route, is through whistleblower claims. And this is when a disgruntled employee or a competitor, or who knows, somebody who decides they might have that the government might have been defrauded, will bring a claim forward on behalf of the federal government. And so they file a lawsuit. It's kept under seal for a period of time. The government will then evaluate. So one of the obligations that the KETAM whistleblower, or they're called relators. So one of the obligations that the relator has is to bring forward all of the evidence and information that they believe supports their claim to the assistant U.S. attorney who's reviewing it. So they bring that to the table, it gets reviewed, and then there's an investigation that the government engages in to evaluate the claims. And then at some point, the government will issue what's called an intervention decision. And we'll make a decision, are we going to take over the case or not? And if the government intervenes, then the government really drives the case forward. If the government does not intervene, then the whistleblower has a choice of either dismissing the case or proceeding with the case, and bringing the case, continuing to bring the case forward, but with the whistleblower's counsel. In either case, the whistleblower can take 25 to 30% of the proceeds, and then the rest goes to the United States.
Yeah, wow. So quite an incentive for the whistleblower there. And we'll talk about a case in a minute where the whistleblower received quite a large sum. So just a couple more comments on this case, and we'll go to the next one. The initial, some of you may be thinking, how did this happen? I think St. Jude initially considered the risk to be small and later determined it to be larger. And this is from the Star Tribune. St. Jude acknowledges that it continued to ship its stock of the old devices for 17 months after making a design improvement that reduced the potential for the device to lose power unexpectedly. Unfortunately, there were 2 confirmed cases of patients dying after the battery problem caused the device not to administer the shock. So again, yep.
Okay. I'm sorry, Mark. So what I was going to say, what I think is an interesting sort of thought exercise is to compare this case to the Gardner case that happened, I believe, was it maybe 11 years ago now, 2010. There was this big criminal case that was brought against Gardner. And I think there's some striking similarities to the fact pattern. Both of these cases involved ICDs with battery failures caused by short circuiting that resulted in patient deaths. Both cases involved multiple models of the devices that the companies manufactured. Both cases alleged that the companies downplayed the significance of the defects when they talked to the FDA about it and said that they hadn't resulted in serious harm to patients when in fact patients had been harmed. And it's striking to me that, the Gardner case was a $260 million criminal fine. And this case was, a much smaller False Claims Act penalty. And other than the sort of the general scope of the damages, what tripped this from, or the Gardner case from a False Claims Act case to a criminal case, and why was this, treated a little bit less harshly? And the only difference that I can identify, and maybe there are other commentators out there with different views, is that one of the things that Gardner did was issue a silent recall. And so they they actually very clearly were aware of the fact that there was a problem going on long after they had made their report to the FDA, and they sent these sort of emergency notifications out to doctors in the form of a product update, which really, kind of, I think, angered the FDA. And I'm wondering, or, speculating, I guess, that maybe it's the failure to report to the FDA when it became really, really clear that they knew that there was a problem that may have pushed it from being just treated as a kind of a more run-of-the-mill False Claims Act case and into the criminal territory.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. A transparency issue.
Yeah.
All right, let's go to the next slide. There are more FDA cases out there. We're just kind of, again, giving you a sampling here. Let's kind of shift gears and get into more anti-fraud. So this is Medicrea case. This is a French company. Ultimately, the allegations involve bribing this French company bribing doctors, American doctors, and ultimately not reporting the payments for the Sunshine Act, for example. So this resulted in AKS FCA, a settlement for $1 million there, and also $1 million to resolve the Sunshine Act violations. We're starting to see more Sunshine Act cases. This was interesting. This is one of several that have occurred in the last year, related Sunshine Act cases, that is. So the Sunshine Act was really unenforced for from 2013 to 2020, and now it's I think it's here to stay. Any settlement that comes out is related to bribery, unless the bribes were reported, which is unlikely. Then we're going to see a Sunshine Act settlement or fine. So a little bit on the details here. This involved a whistleblower who is the chief training officer for the company. So again, this is that key tam type of case that Dulcie talked about earlier. This employee, felt like the concerns raised were not addressed. And so ultimately the employee said, well, I'm going to make a complaint here. I thought, just kind of interesting, the states getting involved. There's 30 state plaintiffs as well who had False Claims Act statutes that also had key tam laws. So just think about, that even if there's not federal reimbursement, sometimes in cases, and in this case there may be state laws that protect private payers, and their statutes are broader than the federal government in terms of not limiting the potential claims to just federal payers. It can cover Aetna, United Health Group, and so on and so forth. We're not going to make y'all anti-fraud lawyers today, but just something to think about. Exclusions mandatory in criminal offenses, for example, Medicare fraud, permissive for civil claims with kickbacks and false claims. So these cases we're talking about are civil, but exclusion from industry is a specter for executives and companies involved in these.
We call it the corporate death penalty in my practice.
Yeah. Why is that?
Because many manufacturers can't stay in business if they can't sell to hospitals that are taking payments from Medicare.
Yeah, I think I heard once that it was over 99% of healthcare, clinic, hospital, et cetera, accepts federal payment on one level or another. So like you said, it's the death sentence. If you get excluded, you're done. You can't sell product to anyone accepting federal dollars. AKS, $25,000 fine per kickback, jail up to 5 years. And as we mentioned earlier, if the AKS is violated, then False Claims Act is violated. And that was, I want to say, that was part of the Affordable Care Act, wasn't it, Dulcie, when it was amended? I believe
it was treated as part of the False Claims Act before then. It became more explicit at that time, but there were already, before the Affordable Care Act, there were prosecutions under the anti-kickback statute through the False Claims Act, or not prosecutions, but civil cases that were being brought. So there had been some challenges to whether or not that was an appropriate mechanism to bring anti-kickback cases, and so there it was made more explicit at that time. But I would say that it's been that way for well before the Affordable Care Act enactment. Yeah,
that makes sense. Yeah, implied certification theory, and now it's explicit, which makes the government's job easier. So know that if you are accused of a kickback, that the False Claims Act is going to be in play, and you'll largely see these cases described as False Claims Act cases. For that reason, you may be thinking, hey, didn't this involve kickbacks? I don't really think this was reimbursement advice, for example, wasn't an issue. Well, it's because of the kickback just taints the overall transaction. Then the government at the end paying the bill is saying, we're not paying for things where there's a kickback involved, and we're not paying for things if the device is defective under the FDA cases we just chatted about. This case and the others we'll talk about, there's just something going on in terms of bribery, again, that's tainting the transaction. These complaints you can find online generally. If anyone wants them, send me an email and I'll send them to you in case you're suffering from insomnia some night. You can get into some of these cases. Some of them the complaints are quite long. But here the government said that these are quotes from the complaint. I'll just highlight a couple. Medicare knowingly provides kickbacks in the form of financial incentives, discounts, and other inducements to healthcare providers to gain their business in contravention of federal law. Some of the facts involved family and friends being provided entertainment, meals, the company taking people to sporting events, entertainment. One of the key claims was that the U.S. physicians were taken to France for a meeting and all expense paid, and the government construed those payments as kickbacks, and they were not reported. The Sunshine Act. So just a reminder to everybody, if you have a physician that is a U.S. licensed physician and they're going to name the country, those payments are still in bounds. Just because they're outside the U.S. doesn't mean you get a pass on reporting them. One thing that I kind of found interesting in the case, they talked about tying, giving a discount on one product to induce the purchase of another. Sometimes with these complaints, you have to kind of look a little deeper or even be skeptical in terms of how you view them. There are ways to provide bundled discounts, which are perfectly lawful under the discount safe harbor. Of course, the government wasn't about to write in their complaint in a way to try and defend the practice. And obviously, we don't know whether those transactions met the safe harbor or not. They also talked about free evaluation units. AdvaMed contemplates that for device makers. Of course, drug makers provide samples. There was talk about free tech support in the device industry. It's very common for manufacturers to do things like cover cases and provide information on their products. So again, you have to kind of dig a little bit deeper. This settlement overall wasn't as large as some of the others. Maybe, I'm not sure, maybe that's a reflection of the strength of the case. One other just parting thought here I'll make is that this chief training officer, the whistleblower, pointed out that there was poor oversight of compliance. And Amanda and Sandra are going to talk more about compliance later today, but the CEO ran compliance and HR. The government said that was a conflict of interest. They also pointed out that the sales group ran copy review and was reviewing and approving its own materials. So Fox guarding the hen house there. Let's go to the next slide.
Oh, before we move,
sure.
I had just one more comment about the Medicare case, which is just sort of giving you my white collar defense attorney perspective on reading this, and that is that I think this is a whistleblower. It was brought initially as a whistleblower case, and I see multiple different allegations here. I mean, there's sort of a whole bunch of different directions that this goes in. There's even talk of off label, and there's the technical support issue and the discounts issue and the tying issue. All of these different issues get brought And when I see a complaint or a case that involves that many different issues, I automatically think that has to be a whistleblower claim. Because one of the biggest differences I see between cases initiated by the DOJ and cases initiated by whistleblowers is that whistleblowers will throw in the kitchen sink. They just look at everything they can think of, they put it in their complaint, and they want to see what's going to stick. Whereas when the DOJ brings a direct False Claims Act case, what you typically see is that it gets derived from an audit or an analysis of claims data, or maybe they're doing an industry sweep, but usually there's, not more than one or two main legal theories driving the case, which in some ways I think those cases are more difficult, because when the DOJ is really driving something, you know that you've got some trouble, as opposed to when a whistleblower is bringing it. But the whistleblower claims can actually be much more difficult to deal with from a discovery perspective, and from it's like playing whack-a-mole, because there's so many different theories that they will hurl at you, and it can create a moving target that's difficult to deal with. So just my thoughts on what I saw when I saw the complaint in this case is clear whistleblower kind of approach.
Yeah, that makes sense, that whack-a-mole, because you have to respond to all the allegations, and if there's dozens, that takes a lot of time.
Yeah.
Let's go to the next slide here. So Merit Medical, I want to say that this complaint was something like 150 pages long, if I remember. It was
closer to 200.
200. So
the initial complaint was, right. Yeah.
Quite a bit. I think this is your kitchen sink type case, if I'm not mistaken. So here we have another whistleblower, Charles Wolf, MD. He was the chief compliance officer for the company. So something to think about. Again, Dulcie and I both work with executives, CEOs, all sorts of executives running these companies. You got to remember the whistleblower is probably coming from within more often than not. So all the dirty laundry is right in front of them. So you want to, if you find an issue, you want to address it. This chief compliance officer ultimately took issue with a lot. You can see here from the sub bullets. Arguably, the allegations from the complaint was the company provided free services to customers disguised as education. I think that, there's a way to provide education. There's a way to advertise your product collaboratively with customers. There's, AdvaMed has, for example, some guidance around that. It's more common to work with customers on co-promotion in the device industry, certainly. So this boiled down to a local advertising program. They called it LAP. It did not discuss Merit's products. It really was focusing on procedural awareness, but the government ultimately took issue with how the LAP program was designed. I think that, they probably ultimately felt that there was an equitable distribution of costs between the beneficiary, who was the customer, and Merit. The training, this is a quote, supposedly this is said in training, this is off label, but as long as you are fine talking about it, I'm fine continuing. So this was someone that performing training for staff, for salespeople, telling them how to promote off label. So if that, assuming these things are all factual, which I believe they probably are since they're in the complaint, that's obviously an issue. You can't train your staff how to promote off label. There's also a claim that they were promoting an IDE device, an investigational device. You can't promote an investigational device while it's being researched by the FDA. Any other comments on this case, Dulcie, before we go to the next one? I know we have
So I actually I had an opportunity to work on an aspect of this case, although I did not represent Merit Medical. So I have a kind of a different perspective, as you might imagine, from what's set forth in the complaint. It's a one-sided view of things that I think gets presented there. Many whistleblower complaints, this was not entirely consistent with my understanding of the facts. one of the key allegations, and I think the thing that really drove the case, was this allegation about the LAP, or the local advertising program, which involved radio spots that featured doctors that did this procedure. And the product that was being sold was a device called Embosphere, which was sort of an embolization beads that were used to treat uterine fibroids through embolization. And this product is something that is administered by interventional radiologists through minimally invasive surgical procedure. But the patients are really coming not from, most patients don't know who, if you asked anybody on the street, who's your interventional radiologist, they wouldn't be able to answer that question. The patients who get diagnosed with these fibroids are being treated by gynecologists who don't do the procedure. And so the company was really looking at doing a direct to consumer ad campaign simply to make the public aware of the fact that there's this other procedure that exists, as opposed to a much more invasive procedure that gynecologists do, that there's actually a less invasive procedure that could be done by interventional radiologists, that the information might not be getting to the patients because of who their direct contacts are with the gynecologists. And so they launched this campaign, and their device was either had the majority of the market share or all of the market share, a significant amount of the market share. And I think the company's thought was, if we do this ad campaign where we educate patients about the existence of this alternative to what they're being told about by their own doctors, then the patients would come into their appointment with the gynecologist and ask about it. And so the goal was to really make them aware that the procedure exists, and also let them know, Dr. Smith in your locality does this procedure. So they would know, not only that they could get the procedure, that would be less traumatic than the other existing, alternative surgery, and who the doctor is that does it. So these ads were done without reference to the product or the device, but it wasn't, the company wasn't doing it to sort of just benefit the doctor, even though it didn't mention the company name. And if you look at the AdvaMed co-marketing guidance, it will say that the materials should be balanced and promote both the company's technology and the healthcare provider's services. But because these ads didn't directly talk about the company, the government took the view that even though they were splitting the cost of the ads with healthcare providers, that this was a kickback because of the fact that it didn't mention the company's product. And I guess I take issue with that, because there's this nuance that just promoting the procedure and identifying where patients could go to get it done was a benefit to the company. And so I think there was this significant nuance that was missed by the government, and that can happen. A well-intentioned promotional campaign could be taken the wrong way by the DOJ, and they will often put on blinders and take the most jaded view possible of what a company's doing. The other point I wanted to make about this case is that the two lead government lawyers on the case were Andrew Caffrey and Christopher Terranova. And the reason I bring these names up is because this is out of at the time that the Merritt case was going on, out of New Jersey. This has been a very active district in bringing these False Claims Act cases forward. Andrew Caffrey was also involved in the Pacira case. Christopher Terranova was also involved in the Alere case. And so some of the same names keep popping up. And if you happen to see those names on a complaint, just recognize that these guys have a lot of experience and really are focused on bringing these kinds of claims.
That's a great point. Great point. Thank you for that. A couple other parting comments on this. I'll just say I don't think Amanda will probably be recommending, or Sandra, a chili pepper scale for compliance issues. One being the least amount of heartburn, and 3 being so. Just, I think the comment there I have is just think about how things that you maybe think are fun or cute might be viewed by others later. Anyways, we can head to the next slide. We could talk about Novartis for an hour, but I will summarize this just so we can get on with a few other comments before we hand things over to Brent, Sarah. This was a big case though, $642 million settlement, 51 million went to copay foundation related issues, and $591 million for speaker program issues. What's interesting is Novartis was in a CIA back in 2010, and I think the government maybe throttled them here a bit because they feel like they didn't learn the first time. This case involved a whistleblower. This rep is, I couldn't find the end amount that this individual received, the former sales rep, again, a whistleblower, but Fierce Pharma reported $109.4 million. And that person wore a wire to try and record, what were viewed as bribes in the process of being provided and accepted. So quite a payout for the whistleblower here. The foundation issue, again, I'm not going to read the whole slide here. If y'all have questions, you can follow up with us after the program. But the foundation issue really revolves around the government taking the stance that drug companies, mainly device companies, don't use foundations as often, but they say the physician comes across a patient, they can't cover the copay, they don't have the resources to basically get the drug. So that patient gets sent to a foundation. The foundation has charitable, means and policies. So they provide access to the drug by supporting the patient financially, and then the doctor's happy because patients gain the drug, and the drug companies ultimately happy because patients are getting access to the drug, and it means it creates kind of an easier process for just accessing the drug. And the issue the government has with these foundations is that they think that they're just an extension of the drug company, and that the drug company is, telling the foundations what to do. There are a bunch of advisory opinions on point. There's a lot of guidance from government. Some of the advisory opinions have been withdrawn. So you want to be careful if you are running a foundation with how you support that. I should say, you're not running the foundation. How do you support a foundation? Someone else needs to be running it. The other big issue in the case was just speaker programs. And I think this case, more than any others, really drove the fraud alert, which we'll talk about next in a moment here. But, some of the issues that came up here was the government said the speaker program is bogus, quote, little or nothing more than social occasions for the doctors. They took issue with the same attendees at the same programs, which they already attended. They took issue with speakers being paid to deliver a speaker program to one individual, or even still be paid when they didn't do any work. And they also took issue with meal limits being exceeded. There's just a lot of hair on this case. Again, you can take a look at the pleadings in this case, but this really, to me, drove the speaker program fraud alert, which again, we'll talk about in a minute. The restrictions, kind of the aftermath, Novartis is now restricted to paying speakers $10,000 per speaker, max fees $100,000 per year, which is quite low considering how much money they were spending before. The sales function cannot select speakers. Their events have to be virtual, and they can only talk about the drugs for 18 months after FDA approval. And if anyone wants an internal talk, they can't hire a speaker to do that. They need to take someone from their staff. Anything you want to add to this one, Dulcie, before we move on?
Yeah, no, just, and we'll get to this, I think, when we start talking about the update, but they really came down with that corporate integrity agreement hard on Novartis about the speaker program. We know that this alert was out there, but the position that the government seems to be going to, which is, oh, well, you survived COVID with virtual events, so therefore everything needs to be virtual from now on. And that's kind of the limit that they imposed on Novartis. And also, by the way, if you're product has been on the market for the 18 months or more, you don't need to do any more speaking engagements. Everybody knows about it. I think these limits are kind of severe, and it just provides a bit of a roadmap into where the government is going with these kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, let's head to the next slide. These next cases I'll kind of cover quickly. Please jump in also if you have anything to add. But another whistleblower complaint, this was brought by a pharmacist. So again, the prescribers, or in this case, pharmacists, may be involved in a key TAM case. So you want to be mindful of that. This really revolved around research grants, and the whistleblower took the position that they were bogus, and the government, which picked up the case. Quote, little or no documented description of the proposed research, and Pacira also did not document a reasonable commercial need or a fair market value assessment for the grants. So point on this case, government still clearly has grants within its radar. You want to make sure you have a robust grant making function at your company. And yeah, just, all grants obviously should be for bona fide reason, paid at fair market value. There should be milestones. You should make sure the work is being performed, et cetera.
Yeah, I think the point here is that the need to just be scrupulous about your documentation. A lot of companies do this and then they don't document it well. Be sure to get the documents in the file showing that, you had a need for the work, but there was a fair market value analysis done for the amount that was paid. And then there's documentation at the tail end proving that the work was actually done as expected. So.
Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. So DUSA, this involved another whistleblower, so sales team employee who later claimed a retaliatory termination as well, involved a drug that treated actinic keratosis on the face, and ultimately the government alleged that company was promoting off-label. So we often have said, hey, these off-label cases are kind of dead. But again, this were a whistleblower complaint. I think, again, it's the kitchen sink kind of being thrown in with everything, but we're seeing a lot of off-label allegations coming up in these complaints. The government alleged that the company was promoting the product with a blue light, which was intended to be an activator, and it wasn't approved for that use. They also took issue with free products being billed to samples, being billed to Medicare, used as discounts, and then ultimately not reporting these transactions under the Sunshine Act. So it kind of more of the same, I'd say. This went a little bit, how to juxtapose this against the others, is involved in adjunctive use that wasn't approved by FDA. So be mindful of that.
I mean, I think this is just an example of what I was talking about before, of, the sort of the False Claims Act being used as a tool to address off-label issues, and the need to, for these complaints to also include some sort of anti-kickback component for them to be able to bring that legal theory forward.
Yeah. Let's go to the next slide. We won't talk about privacy today, but that's the next kind of storm cloud on the horizon. I hate to sound negative, but the industry does so much good. But we do see privacy becoming a bogey for everyone. So something to think about. Regulators throughout the world are ramping up. Amazon fined almost $1 billion in Europe for GDPR violations, and we have new privacy laws popping up throughout the country. So expect federal legislation in the future. It'll be, so you're going to want to stay on top of your privacy compliance, bottom line. Let's go to the next slide. We're going to talk for a few minutes about the OIG fraud alert. I think everyone's pretty familiar with the fraud alert. It's really the government, again, looking at programs, looking at some of what the violations they saw in Novartis in that case, and trying to get a handle on that. Let's go to the next slide. This was just issued less than a year ago, by the way. Greg Dembski, OIG chief counsel, told the Law 360, great publication, if you don't subscribe to it, interview that drug makers, and they should they could just put device makers in there as well. Should think carefully about the risks of speaker programs, and in particular, in-person speaker programs. As Dulcie mentioned earlier, they're really going after this in-speaker angle, given that the pandemic has demonstrated that high-quality events can be held virtually. So we're, what does the government expect? That they expect you to hold programs virtually now, which, raises questions of First Amendment, chilling free speech, et cetera. But that's what they want. Let's go to the next slide. Frankly, I think, we're seeing manufacturers, they like, a lot of them like the virtual setup. I know Sarah is going to chat about that a little bit in a minute. But so it might just naturally kind of head that way. Here's a little bit more just to jump on that. Risk, and I'll cover this slide pretty quickly, but bottom bullet there, risks associated with speaker programs will continue or will become more pronounced if companies resume in-person speaker programs or increase speaker program related remuneration to HCPs. Let's go to the next. Yeah,
I was just going to say, I worry that what this does is cut out some of the benefit of the in-person programs, particularly where there's demonstrative. On the pharma space, maybe not so much, but in the device space, where you're actually wanting to get your hands on the device, look at it, see how it works. This seems problematic to me.
That was a big kind of, I don't know if complaint is the right word, but MDMA had an OIG official come on and he took questions about this fraud alert, at which I was kind of surprised but happy that he did that. And that was one of the big comments, MDMA is Medical Device Manufacturers Association, where someone said, look, people need to like touch our device and see how it's used. We might have a wet lab or dry lab set up at a speaker program. We can't really just, there's limitations over the internet or, in programs like we're all doing today, where they're really going to impact the device industry. And he appreciated that. And bottom line, this last bullet, he said, we're going to apply a facts and circumstances test. This is just guidance. We're ultimately going to look at the whether there's real value with the programs or not. So yeah, it's a great point, Dulcie. We can go to the next slide. I'll just rattle off some things highlighted here. This is that suspect characteristics test. That's kind of the most infamous part of the alert, if you will. So things they're looking for: little or no substantive information presented. If alcohol is there, pharma has banned alcohol. Brent's going to talk about that at these meetings. Is the location conducive? Some of the complaints talked about meetings being held at sports bars and whatnot, places where they felt like it was really an entertainment venue. Are all the programs the same? Has there been a big time since FDA approval? Let's go to the next slide. Are attendees like frequent flyers, or does everyone there have a legitimate reason for being there? Is sales and marketing picking speakers? Is ROI being performed inappropriately? Like, hey, let's see how much we can get this person to speak, and then see if their sales went up because we're paying them to speak. Is fair market value appropriate, or are you bribing people based on the value or volume of referrals and purchases? Let's go to the next slide. So bottom line, just a couple of comments. Is OIG banning speaker programs? No, but be really careful with them. I think, let's go to the next slide. I think you need to, we would encourage, I think we covered this adequately. We can go to the next slide. I would encourage you to kind of run through and ask yourself some of these questions. Again, you all will have these slides, so I won't run through everything, but definitely a time to audit your speaker program and make sure you're not the next Novartis, because you got to be careful. This is 100% on the radar of the government, clearly. I think that's the end of our presentation. We can hand it back. I don't know, Dulcie, if you have any parting comments. If not, I'll hand it back over to Mary.
No, I would just say it looks like we ran out of time. Didn't have time for a Q&A, but the audience members should feel free to email us with questions after the talk if we don't have managed to get to them today. And apologies for that. We had a lot of content to get through.
Great. Well, thanks, Mark and Dulcie. And like they said, feel free for those people who did send in Q&As to contact them. Next up on our agenda is the impact of recent cases in OAG guidance, which will be presented by Brent Alfison and Sarah Kalgard. So Brent is the VP of Legal Affairs, Chief Compliance Officer, and Corporate Secretary at Upshur Smith Laboratories. He's been there since 2004 and has the overall responsibility for the company's legal and compliance organizations and operations. Brent serves as an executive business partner and provides advice and counsel on a wide range of matters and the pharmaceutical industry generally. Sarah is GC for Canon Medical HIT Division, a leading innovator of enterprise, AI, and collaborative imaging solutions. As general counsel, she leads the HIT Division's global legal, regulatory, and compliance departments and advises the company on a wide range of legal and business issues in a rapidly changing digital health landscape. So with that, welcome to Brent and Sarah. Take it away.
Awesome. Thank you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you great.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Fabulous. Well, this is great. Thank you so much for having us. I really think that what Brett and I are here to do is more or less reinforce that what Mark and Dulcie just went through actually matters in practice, and what we have done as practitioners in drug and device, how we pay attention to these things and take some action. So we're going to take a few minutes and talk about a few cases that have stuck out to us in the last little while. But mostly we intend to talk about what we've done with our companies in response and what we've been seeing and hearing from our colleagues in the industry. None of this is revolutionary, but I do think it's helpful to hear what a couple of GCs are paying attention to. That said, I know we have a bunch of wonderful practitioners online, so please do chime in with any questions or anecdotes, and we'll do our best to get to them as well. So with that, if you will please advance the slide. Awesome. So on the device side, you heard Mark and Dulcie really talk through the recent cases in detail, but I wanted to include a couple of them just in the presentation for context. I'm not going to go deep into them, but I think it's helpful to ground. We've got the one where the French company, it's an American, and its American affiliate really just wined and dined the heck out of some doctors overseas and then failed to report. Fairly straightforward on the false claims, but I think people were a little surprised that the Sunshine non-compliance doubled their settlement. Sure. We watched out for that. We noticed that. Second is the case of the South Dakota neurosurgeon / restaurateur. Here they got dinged hard on Sunshine again, over $1 million, because they essentially underreported the ownership interest. But here they did report the activity, they just didn't get the ownership interest remuneration. And I have to say, maybe it's just the local connection. I feel for the compliance team a bit on this one. The government obviously alleged that the sales team knew the ownership relationship well. But you could see a world in which the information simply doesn't get to the compliance team. Historically, the Sunshine reporting team is typically a bunch of numbers people just trying to match the receipts to the docs. But as we'll talk about later, we obviously need to do more than that. And there are some additional questions that I think we're all asking now. So more on these and how they've shaped our practices soon. But I'll turn it over to Brent, who's going to talk a bit about some drug cases and the guidance he's been watching.
Yeah, thank you. So similar to the device world, which I know we're steeped in deeply here in the Twin Cities, maybe less so in the pharma space, but Upshur Smith has certainly been in the Twin Cities since 1917. So we've been around. There is drugs. There are drug pharmaceutical companies in Minnesota. And we like to have our voice heard. Certainly, the cases again, Mark and Dulcie spoke to Novartis. Even prior to that, Teva had got themselves into some problems. And as I look at these cases from the drug perspective, and in particular with respect to speaker programs, You can see where, as Mark pointed out in the fraud alert, you can see where the OIG is saying, "Hey guys, you're doing just fine. Why open this Pandora's box of potential compliance concerns?" And this is rooted in history, right? So these actions of Teva, these actions of Novartis, and even on the next slide, the DUSA case as well, are all instances of past conduct. But and you can advance the slide. There we go. But I would point out as a pharma lawyer, the pharma code, which has governed our interactions with physicians, has existed since 2002, and it was kind of a big deal when it was updated in 2009, and it's been recently updated as a result of the fraud alert. So the fact that these actions were going on and these physician speaker programs and other events were being held with the facts that we see as late as 2016. I agree, Sarah, that we as compliance officers may often be the last to know, but at the same time, if you, in the drug world, if you were still doing these activities in 2016, you were asking for trouble. And I do understand, Dulcie, as well, right? We don't always get the full story from these reports, but at least the appearance of impropriety is still existing. Next slide, please. So Sarah, again, I think you hit on it, right? And Mark and Dulcie, the False Claims Act, the anti-kickback statute, those are kind of the levers that get the federal government involved. But with respect to speaker programs, lunch and learns, whatever it might be, we are concerned about this increased use of the Sunshine Act, the Open Payments Law, to kind of pile on and double awards. And again, all of this is a lucrative industry for whistleblowers who, funny enough, sometimes seem to be whistleblowers in multiple cases. So they are, maybe it's their professional job is to be a whistleblower. And again, none of us want to be under a covert integrity agreement. We've not come close, knock on wood. But you read those, the restrictions and the requirements, and that's nowhere I want to be. Next slide, please. Sarah, if you want to add, I think this has probably been covered, but I think the key takeaway for us from a speaker program standpoint is the OIG is skeptical that these even have a reason to exist. Now, I would agree with Dulcie at that last point she made. Even in the drug world, there are instances where the in-person exchange, the in-person gatherings and exchange of information are much more effective, much more just leaves a lasting impression on what we're trying to achieve in the drug space. The challenge we see, for example, is converting a market from oral to nasal is a challenge Upshur Smith is familiar with, for example. And you just can't really do that and help make that point about why or how this is an important development, in a virtual environment. Next slide. And again, as I mentioned, so the pharma code I did mention has been revised yet again, effective January 1st of 2022. And then just some data to kind of ground people on where pharma companies were at. Anecdotally, we are hearing roughly 20% of the physicians we work with, or the physicians we work with, are saying about 20% of their speaker programs are in person. So roughly 80% remain virtual. This is a fairly recent survey, and kind of setting out where people stand, at least in the pharma industry, and some of the largest pharma companies are part of that survey. Um, you know, again, I go back to say none of this should be surprising to anybody. None of the requirements of the fraud alert, all of this were things that we were doing starting in 2002. Reaffirmed in 2009. So again, what we see in the fraud alert, the special characteristics that OIG has identified, most of that maybe required some tweaks, and we'll speak to that, but really was not a surprise. And I threw in the last bullet in case there are those of you out there. It is important that we hear this all the time at our little compliance events, the culture of compliance. Make sure you're training on your code of conduct fundamentally, so people at least have a baseline of expectation of compliance, and then obviously, with respect to speaker programs, with respect to other specific activities that you engage in, make sure you have policies and procedures and that you're training on them. Next slide.
Awesome.
Okay.
So in terms of some of the impacts that we're dealing with, we kind of look at this and go, and we pay attention to what's happening with pharma as well. They seem to be just a titch ahead in terms of what this all means and in terms of impacts and what we're doing. As we've mentioned several times, overarchingly, these are basic things. Don't wine and dine, keep it modest, all the things we've been reinforcing forever, but it's amazing how the cases continue. So in terms of some of the things I put together, first on the slide, I'm not sure it needs to be first, but it's what first came to mind when talking about culture of compliance. Make sure you have an auditing program in check. This is, of course, one of the 7 elements of an effective compliance program, but I think it's one that gets overlooked the most. And then you need to have some teeth. And this is really about finding the information before someone has a chance to bring it up externally, as well as creating that culture of awareness and compliance. If our salespeople see that we're checking their conduct and seeing action taken, they're of course more likely to course correct on their own. Second, and this, it's just table stakes, but use these cases. Publicize them. So at our company, we have an executive compliance committee that meets frequently, and we start each meeting with compliance in the news. And we talk about these types of cases. The facts are interesting. I find it the most effective if you can pull some thread to connect it to the practices that you and your organization does, and how without those practices, you could see how this could potentially happen. Third, go through your checklist, check your checklist, ask the right questions. Are you asking the right questions of the right people? Do you ask about ownership relationship? That has to go on everyone's checklist now. Are you seeing repeat business at certain establishments? I think it's really helpful that you go through these activities and certainly check in. And then look at trends and analytics before you report. The government is apparently getting a bit more tech savvy as well as collaborative among its agencies. So it's important to do your own trends and looking at aggregate data, look at suspicious amounts, look at locations, et cetera. Next, reconnect with your first lines of defense. Brent touched on this as well, but make sure they get it. My department attends every annual sales meeting, and we present, and then we hang around, right? And it never fails how much the cases and presentations feel the same. You feel like you're just saying the same thing, but someone will always ask a slight nuance or some sort of question or pull you aside, and you know that it's a worthwhile endeavor. So I reinforce that for sure. And then finally, Mark touched on this a little bit too, and I recognize that there's a lot of importance in face-to-face interaction, particularly depending on the device. If it's an interventional situation, if there's a lot of complexity in training and those kinds of things, I recognize the importance of in-person events. I think you do get more out of them in a variety of contexts. That being said, pay attention to virtual opportunities presented by the pandemic. My sales folks, will push in person all the day long, But I have found it helpful, and it makes my CFO really happy to really look at the ROI on the in-person programs versus the virtual programs. Because as you can imagine, virtual programs present far less risk from our standpoint. And we think that the regulators are onto this too. We think that they are noticing that we have managed to turn ourselves into a virtual world, and that then the in-person and some of the things that go with it are maybe less important. So we're watching that trend as well. So those are some of the things that we're doing on our end. Brent, do you want to take it home with what's happening on your end?
Sure. So next slide, please. Oh, good. And thanks, Sarah. And interestingly, so when Sarah and I were speaking about this program and thinking about sharing stories and sharing examples to highlight to compliance committees in particular what we are facing in the drug and device space. So Sarah and I both have Japanese parent companies, and at least in my case, so our company was acquired by a Japanese company in 2017. Had no prior experience in the United States in pharmaceuticals. As you can imagine, that's a completely different space, the pharmaceutical world in Japan as opposed to the U.S. So I do think it's very important to have that line of education to your compliance committee, to your board of directors, especially in cases where the parent company or your ownership may lack experience in drug or device. So again, things we've hit on, just want to reinforce, if you don't have policies in these areas, speaker programs, whatever it might be, make sure you adopt those policies. Make sure if you have the policies, you're updating them, and read the fraud alert. Take a look at the suspect characteristics. Make sure that those are being addressed in your policies and your procedures. Make sure you have guidance around when to use HCPs, when to use your internal people. In the pharma space, we have trainers that are pharmacists, and we have trainers that are physicians or nurses, and those come prepaid, right? They're already on salary, and so adding the risk of using external healthcare providers is mitigated to a degree. As Sarah says, question whether or not you need to be in person. OIG thinks the virtual is fine, and just anecdotally from our company's perspective, we are having decent luck with the virtual environment, not just for speaker programs, but again for I guess what we call lunch and learns. Certainly, when you are sitting at your desk in an office, you are minimizing the risk of exorbitant meals or fancy or inappropriate venues, and again even alcohol, which pharma starting January 1st is banning from the educational exchange environments. And pharma, again, is guidelines, right? So as is AdvaMed, but there are states like California in particular that have said pharma, you must follow the pharma code. And presumably they're saying the same thing about AdvaMed. So as much as these are guidelines, you are expected to follow. I think we've hit on some of this, right? Mark may have mentioned, I think as part of his presentation, who's selecting your speakers? Is it your sales and marketing staff? Make sure that's not the case. Make sure they're being properly vetted by an independent group in your organization. We've seen historically issues with companies who are training hundreds of speakers. Do you really need hundreds, or is this just another avenue for you to compensate physicians and make yourself special as they are looking to prescribe for particular disease states? Same with our, what's their status? Are they high prescribers? That adds an element of risk. And make sure, right, you're training these speakers. You're training them on the products. You're training them on how to use the products. You're training them how to stay on label during their presentations. And that compliance training is critical. How do you keep them on script? And then how do you monitor these events to ensure that they stay on script? And if the speaker goes off script, are the sales reps or those in attendance trained to course correct and pull them back? All of that is important. Dulcie mentioned, documentation. We need to, as we look at speaker programs, there is a process that you are establishing a need. You're pitching, your commercial team is pitching to the compliance department the need for a speaker's program, or an ad board or whatever it might be. And you are, as part of that process, doing a fair market value analysis of the compensation paid to the speakers or the participants. So it's important. And then I guess my one final point, at least, on the Sunshine Act. So we, for better or worse, the compliance function in our company does the Sunshine Act reporting. So we see and first of all, it's very important that you have a system, a finance system that feeds the information that you need into some sort of reporting tool for the Sunshine Act. As part of that process, we found it very helpful to have compliance involved, because not only are you seeing all of the expenses that are being sent through, and at that time you are able to I'll say, audit for inappropriate spend, audit for inappropriate trends. For example, doing 12 speaker programs at the same restaurant in South Dakota, I would hope would have raised a flag in somebody who's reviewing those expenses. May not have ultimately revealed who owned the restaurant, but might have been the only one around that was an appropriate venue. But in any event, it gives me a little greater comfort that I've got a director of compliance looking at, who also happens to be a former CPA. So she likes numbers. I'm not a number guy. But that, I think, is a helpful peek into how our reps are doing their business. So ultimately, at the very bottom, just again, respond to compliance concerns, adapt as you need, tell different stories as they arise, stay in touch with your outside counsel, who are paying maybe even closer attention than we are in-house. We sometimes have a few other things going on. And that's it for that slide. Again, these are just repeat of the earlier points. OIG is interested in this stuff. FDA, FTC, they love pharma and device. I had hoped that they would move on to the Googles and the Microsofts of the world. I think they have, but not as fully as I had hoped. We've got a fair number of issues that we're dealing with the government, none of which we think are worth the government's time. And of course, the subsequent private plaintiffs that like to get involved make things even worse. So none of this is fun to be involved in.
Awesome. Well, I don't know. I mean, we're a little bit ahead of schedule. I don't know if anyone has any questions for us. Feel free to add them in the chat. One thing I will anecdotally add for any digital health lawyers who are out there, right? So we develop at my company medical imaging software. We're very much a medical device, software as medical device have for a long time, and so fall squarely within the AdvaMed code and do everything we can to comply. But one of the fascinating things we've encountered as a department as of late is with kind of the influx of digital health investment and innovation. There are a lot of companies who are just dabbling, and they don't find themselves, or they at least don't conduct themselves as if they are subject to these codes of regulations. And so that's just a unique, a unique situation. I find myself as a compliance leader and legal leader is trying to kind of navigate our sales folks to the, the hybridized trade shows where Microsoft or, Google shows up and they're giving away a lot of things, right? And so we're watching that. That's a trend we're most certainly watching as the full scale tech med device companies. I just thought that was maybe something worth noting for the other digital health lawyers who are out there.
Thanks for that, Sarah. We do have one question that came in, and then we're going to move into actually wrapping up some questions outstanding from the previous presentation. But for Brent and Sarah, there's a question about who in the company should be selecting speakers and any recommendations or practices that you'd recommend there.
Do you want to take it, Brent? I can add, or you want me to go?
Yeah, no, I can. I think so. What we train our sales reps and our commercial team on is they can, because they're the front line, so they know who's good in a jurisdiction. They know who the best, migraine doctor is in Chicago. But they are limited to only referring that name of that expert to our scientific team, our medical affairs folks. So the commercial team can make recommendations. They cannot approve who are actually the speakers that are selected and trained. Again, obviously their opinion has weight, but the formal approval is not in the sales and marketing function. So we limit that to our medical and compliance teams.
Yeah. We function very similarly. We have a policy and process. We call it the throw it over the fence, right? Like suggestions are fine. They're on the front lines, but we actually have a process on the back end that keeps sales and marketing really out of the ultimate selection so that we've got the identified criteria upon which we would ever consider someone based on their talents, expertise, familiarity, those things.
And just, I think I know years ago when we first started doing speaker programs, we ran afoul, I would say, of this idea that you should only train really the speakers that you need. I think we thought, oh, Jesus, this is going to be huge. We trained, 100 and some speakers. And I think we learned not only do you not need that many speakers, and of course OIG would say you don't need that many speakers, but you really learn to look for your geographic experts. You look for your the folks who are expert in their field, whether they're physicians or whether they're nurse practitioners, whatever it might be, in the Midwest, for example, or in the I suppose the East Coast is a little bigger, but you pick your jurisdictions, you pick your expert. And it's not a surprise when those names come over the fence, right? It's like, oh yeah, well, it's Dr. Diamond in Chicago. So it's a lot more efficient. You save a fair amount of money because you're not training speakers that you ultimately never use, and of course you lower your risk in having too many speakers trained. But who they are, it tends not to be a big surprise. And it is it is an effective tool to have these peer-to-peer conversations, with speaker programs in particular. So it's, again, you want to have a well-documented process, and part of that is as well a fair market value analysis. You don't want to be paying. You see Novartis, under a corporate integrity agreement, limited to $100,000 a year, or $10,000. A speaker, I think it was, but the one way to help that space is to ensure that your budget is fairly small. So when you do a fair market value analysis, when you hire an appropriate number of doctors or healthcare practitioners, again, you're both limiting your compliance risk and you're making your CFO smile.
Wonderful, thank you, Brent and Sarah. We're going to take a 15-minute break now. Our next program starts at 9:45. That's deploying a compliance program and performing investigations. But because we had so many great questions asked during our first session, recent FDA, AKS, and FCA cases, we're going to spend some of that break revisiting those questions. So I'm going to invite Mark and Dulcie back. So feel free, if you're not interested in those questions, to grab a cup of coffee, check some emails. Otherwise, we're going to spend about 10 minutes on questions and then 5 minutes so everyone can run to the restroom if they need it.
Thank you. Appreciate the encore here. Not quite like your favorite band playing a few more songs at the end of the show, but a little bit more nerdy. But yeah, Dulcie, I'll just kind of run through a few questions and then we're going to take a break as well. And we'll be back on. So one person asked regarding the Metacrea case, and this could go for any case, should any blame be placed on the physicians who allowed themselves to be bribed? And, you know, we don't know that case intimately. We've read the pleadings, but that's about it. But it suffice it to say, with the anti-kickback statute, if whoever's offering the bribe or receiving it, there's accountability on both ends of the transaction. So, you know, that's something we remind clients of often. It's because a lot of times you'll have a situation where our client, the manufacturer, may be dealing with a hospital or someone like that, and they're kind of pushing them on fair market value issues, saying this is fine, or we don't need all this detail in our SOW. And it's like, well, actually you do, because it's required by the safe harbor and we're all in this together. So anything to add there, Dulcie?
Yeah, so the question asked, you know, I think the implicit in the question is, why are we talking about the manufacturer and not talking about the doctors here? And I will just say that in my practice, I have defended many doctors who are accused of bribing. So it is not solely that these cases get focused on manufacturers, although typically the manufacturers have deeper pockets than the doctors do, even though a lot of doctors do quite well financially. They're not big companies. They're usually smaller physician practices. And so sometimes that's what drives litigation. It's a real sort of crass, you know, kind of determination of who's got the money. I've been involved in many cases though where I've got cases where both the manufacturer and the doctor are defendants in the same False Claims Act case. One of the biggest False Claims Act matters I have ever handled was a case that was venued. Well, first it was in the District of Massachusetts, and then went up on appeal in the First Circuit. And we defended. I think there was the Ketam relator had, and this was one of these combination off-label anti-kickback cases, had alleged claims against 106 consultants who had consulted with a device manufacturer. And we had most of those consultants as our clients in the case. And so it is certainly true that the doctors are just as culpable and they're just as likely to get sued. It's just there's a little bit more incentive for these Ketam relators and the government, frankly, to go after the manufacturers because that's where the money is.
Yeah, great comments. I think that's just another practice point, more on the transactional side, but for the manufacturers out there, you know, you want to know who you're retaining. You want to vet them. You're going to want to use the SAM checks. You're going to want to see if they're on the OIG exclusions list, et cetera. Because if I don't know what's going on, you know, with prosecutors and whatnot, but perhaps certain people are on their list, right? That they're thinking this is someone that's been wrapped up into some issues before. So we're going to keep an eye on them. And if you show up on open payments, paying that person, that could be an issue for you. So you want to be careful with who you retain. You know, there could be a lot of metaphors we could get into there, but you're ultimately partnering with that individual. So be careful. The Metacrea case kind of sparked a lot of questions. There's another one. Someone asked, are there additional details about what discounts were at issue? And that was a case where they talked about tying. And just to talk a little bit about the discount safe harbor, at one point products couldn't be bundled. Then the rules changed. Products can be bundled as long as they're part of the or reimbursed on the same payment methodology, and the discount safe harbor requirements are met regarding disclosing any discounts and informing the buyer of their duty to report said discounts to payers. So, we didn't really, they didn't get into the detail in the pleadings on those discounts. I suspect that this kind of goes back to Dulcie's point, where it was a kitchen sink complaint and they very well could have been lawful. We don't know. Perhaps maybe they were fine in meeting the discount safe harbor. Maybe they weren't. I don't know. If the seller, if Medicrea didn't inform the buyer of their obligation to report discounts, for example, associated with bundling or tying, as they call it in the complaint, then they'd fail the safe harbor test.
Yeah, I mean, I think it was the specifics that I'm aware of is that it was the provision of free devices in exchange for other purposes. So, and the government, or at least the relator, felt like the discounts were actually allowing free product to be provided.
Great. Another question about travel perks, and I believe that was also Medicrea. If I'm remembering the complaint right, don't quote me on this, but I think they were talking about a $10,000 business class ticket. I can appreciate doctors traveling from Europe to the United States need leg room. I think, you can look at, are you paying for Delta One, which is like a very elite travel class? It's the top for Delta, for example. I don't know of any higher with maybe United has something that's like that, but versus just more of a business class ticket that is not, one of these deals where you have a bed essentially and your own small kind of partitioned room, if you will, on the plane. So, I mean, I think you need to, as a organization, start to think about what sort of perks go over the line in terms of travel. What about, you're going to be at the Ritz-Carlton versus a Hilton or something. I think you need to establish a policy where the expenses are reasonable and not intended to be some sort of over the edge inducement. I don't know, Dulcie, if you have anything to add there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that struck me about Medicrea was that they not only paid for the tickets, but they paid for spouses and girlfriends to go along. And once they got there, I mean, it was like, it was trips to France to this big research society meeting. And when they got there, it wasn't just attending the seminar. They had wine tastings, I think even in some cases kids were allowed to come along.
That's right.
There was all kinds of sporting events. It was travel / vacation, not just we're buying a ticket for this doctor to come and speak or to attend an event. It was it really kind of has some of those. I do a lot of Foreign Corrupt Practices Act work, as well as work in this space. And one of the things we look for, we've got sort of key things that we look for when travel expenses are paid for, when we're doing an investigation into potential FCPA issues. And, does a spouse come along? Are there these entertainment venues that are involved? Are there a lot of lavish travel perks that make it look more like a vacation than like a legitimate business meeting? And this one had all the markers that we look for.
Yes.
Yeah.
And again, the complaints are kind of blending together a little bit in my mind. I can't remember which one it was, but they actually had like what appeared to be travel brochures, something that, you would have seen from a travel agent highlighting trips to Portugal and Ireland and Hawaii. And it was kind of like, well, this is clearly has there's an ulterior motive involved. So, be careful with those types of collateral that would go around. It shouldn't be, like Dulcie said, it shouldn't be a vacation with the family. And I do recall now actually that they had the families going along as well and covering their expenses. Another comment, commenter said, can you comment on the consulting agreement issue? The allegation was that it was bogus. consulting, that work wasn't performed, no one followed up on it. And this kind of goes back to, you can go back to 2007 DPA with orthopedic makers, where same allegations there, where consultants were put on retainer and never performed work. So that's one reason we advise against ever paying retainers. I mean, there may be possibly some sort of scenario where that could work, but generally you should just pay these folks by the hour. They should submit an invoice detailing what they did, and then you pay them for that. There are situations we've seen where you may have a physician that is maybe even retired, and they're working for the company as a chief medical officer, and they're working significant amount of hours, and there's maybe some sort of retainer arrangement there. But generally, 99% of the time you should just be paying by the hour, and there needs to, even if you're paying a retainer, you're going to need to reconcile that what you're paying them is for work that they actually performed.
I think we're running out of time with our Q&A.
All right.
So we'll hand it back to Mary now.
Right, so we're going to take that 5-minute break. We have some great hold music for you. So we'll see you in about 5 minutes.
Thanks, Mary.
All right, welcome back. I hope that music was everything that you wanted it to be. It was for me, at least. So we are now moving on to our next event. And for those who did not join us for the first two, welcome. Just a few housekeeping. We are doing questions and answers during these sessions that you can submit at any time at the bottom of your screen. But just to note, we are going to hold having our presenters answer them just due to the nature of online webinars. So next, we are joined by Amanda Johnston from Gardner Law. Amanda specializes in counseling medical technology and pharmaceutical companies on FDA law, regulatory submissions, and and strategy, healthcare compliance programs, and fraud and abuse laws. Prior to practicing at Gardner Law, she was the compliance officer at Coloplast Corporation. She was in regulatory affairs at Medtronic and in compliance at United Health Group. Amanda is also an adjunct professor of law at Mitchell Hamlin School of Law, where she teaches drug and device law. Thanks for joining us today, and take it away, Amanda.
All right, thank you very much. I think, oops, I went ahead a little bit. But yeah, hopefully, thanks for joining everyone for the webinar today. Hopefully you're enjoying it. I know it's been really interesting just listening. Hearing from Mark and Dulcie and Sarah and Brent, a little bit about kind of the cases that we're seeing, the enforcement trends. And now we're going to talk a little bit more kind of logistics about a compliance program for companies so that we are mitigating those risks that we talked about. So let me see, I missed the slide here, sorry. There we go. So a lot of clients come to us when they're, just starting out, they have a product, they hear they need a compliance program. And a lot of people find it hard to define exactly what a compliance program is. So it definitely is more than just some policies and procedures that you write down and put in a notebook and put on your shelf. It really is a structure. It's an infrastructure, and it consists of rules, so compliance standards. There has to be some consequences or teeth behind those rules. It's the culture, it's the staff, it is a training program, and it's really something that continues to be maintained throughout the company's life. And Sandra will talk a little bit more about kind of maintaining a compliance program. But it also includes response protocols. So really the goal of a compliance program is preventing misconduct. We want to reduce risk for the company, the employees, and our customers, but we also want to reduce incidences of noncompliance, detect noncompliance faster when it does happen, and then take action to prevent it from happening again. So again, it's not just policies and procedures, but of course that's a big piece of it as well. If you think about it, drug and device companies are subject to so many different complex laws. We heard about FCA, FDA, AKS, Sunshine, the alphabet soup. Compliance is just not going to happen by chance. So it really has to be a deliberate, intentional act when you're setting up your company and building the culture to really be a culture of compliance. So why do you need a compliance program? So I guess first off, I will say that really it is an expectation from the government that any company that's in the medical device or drug space, they're expecting you to have a compliance program. On top of that, many state laws actually require it. So there's several states, depending on whether you're in the drug or device space. There are states that actually require your company to have a compliance program if you're selling in that state. Again, it's strongly recommended. I would go further and say that it is an expectation to do business in this area for lots of reasons. So if you are actually participating in federal healthcare programs, so if you are billing, if that's your business model, it is required under the Patient Protection and Affordable Care Act. So having a compliance program is a requirement if you are actually participating. Generally it shows good corporate citizenship, being an ethical company and having a kind of a mission and a values related to being ethical really does carry weight with the public, with regulators, especially customers, investors. So having that story and incorporating that culture of compliance into really embedding into the business does carry a lot of weight in the industry. It enhances your reputation, your public image. And above that, it also empowers employees to really ask questions, think critically, voice concerns. Some of this, may result in investigations, which we'll talk about, which are normal. But we do want our staff to be aware that the company is committed to being compliant, and that we want employees to ask questions and bring up issues that they see, because then we can take action and fix them. It also reduces employee misconduct. So I think Sarah had mentioned, the more you train employees and vocalize that you are looking at these things, that they will course correct on their own eventually. And that's kind of the goal. But also proactive detection and mitigation of misconduct. And Mark and Dulcie talked a lot about, and Sarah and Brent, about some of the cases that we've seen with the really high dollar amounts. So another, obvious reason to have an effective compliance program is to really reduce those exposures to civil damages, monetary penalties, criminal sanctions, exclusion, the death penalty of the business. And then of course, whistleblower lawsuits. So we've seen that those have become quite prevalent, and almost every case we talked about was related to whistleblower actions. CIAs, obviously those are not fun to go through. But essentially just having an effective compliance program. So the US sentencing guidelines talks about what can be done, or how the company can reduce their culpability score. And so if you have an effective compliance program and you can demonstrate that it is effective, you may get a little bit more leniency when it comes to settling or enforcement activity. All right, so I think everybody probably is aware of the OIG's 7 elements of an effective compliance program. So the OIG's published several guidances on compliance program structure and kind of what they expect to see. There is one specifically for pharmaceutical companies, which also applies to medical devices and any other products that are reimbursed federally. But I'll go through these pretty quickly, and then we're going to focus kind of on investigations, which relates to elements 6 and 7. So implementing written policies and procedures and a code of conduct or standard of conduct. Obviously, as I mentioned at the beginning, compliance program is more than just written policies and procedures. You actually have to implement them, deploy them, use them, and then continue to modify as needed. So there's some key policies that you'll want to take note of at the beginning. I'll touch on that in a minute. Of course, designating a compliance officer, so someone who is the focus of the compliance program at the company, whether that is a full-time, compliance officer or somebody in quality or internal audit that wears the compliance officer hat kind of in the interim. You could also engage an outside consultant or outside counsel to act as your compliance officer, but really having somebody that their focus is on compliance. That's critical. And then, of course, impaneling a compliance committee. So that would be, a panel of usually representatives from various functions that meets regularly to actually oversee and help the compliance officer with the implementation of the program and any issues that come up and taking action to correct those issues. Conducting effective training and education. So the government really would like to see an annual training program where, sales staff and anyone who has interactions with healthcare professionals receives healthcare compliance training at the time of hire, along with annual refresher training or ad hoc training as needed. There may be times when an issue arises or a question comes from the field and you'll want to go back and kind of do a refresher training. But they want to see that you have a cadence, that there is a program that's built, and that you're continually reviewing and addressing any changes that need to be made. Kind of looking back to the cases that we talked about. So thinking about the trends, maybe you want to retrain on speaker programs or, provide a little bit more detailed information for the sales staff that's involved in speaker programs. The government would want to see that. Number 4 is developing effective lines of communication. So this is kind of relating to having a visible compliance officer, having an open door policy where anybody can go and ask questions, sharing the identity of the compliance officer, obviously, so that employees and staff know where to go when they have questions. That's important because, if a question comes up in the field and they don't know who to ask, they may just decide on their own without seeking input. This also applies to a compliance hotline or compliance reporting system, which we'll talk about in a few minutes here, where there's a method or manner to report compliance questions or concerns or allegations that they may choose to report anonymously. So it's important to have that open door communication policy with the compliance officer. Conducting internal monitoring and auditing. So we talked about that a little bit already, but essentially having a program that's documented and followed for auditing. So regular auditing, there are some states that require you to attest annually that you completed your compliance audits. And then monitoring is really a lot of the day-to-day compliance stuff. So it's answering questions, it's checking expense reports, it's just kind of the day-to-day ongoing work that you will do as you're really monitoring the compliance program. And then 6 and 7 relate to, of course, we have policies and procedures, and there are standards and disciplinary actions that would be taken if those policies or compliance standards are violated. So that's important because it shows that there are teeth behind the rules and that they will be enforced consistently and through guidelines that are set in advance. And then responding promptly to detected offenses and undertaking corrective action. So this really relates to the investigations topic, which we'll talk about, but essentially, if you become aware of an issue, take prompt action to look into it, determine if an investigation needs to be done, and then follow the investigation through to completion and take corrective action that needs to be taken in accordance with the outcome of the investigation. All right, so a lot of our clients will come to us and they will, we go through the process of explaining what a compliance program is, why you need it. They see the list of the 7 elements and they're like, oh my gosh, that's a lot. Where do I start? I can't do everything at once. So I tried to distill down to kind of 10 categories, I suppose, that you could say to think about. And this is not necessarily in order, but it's just kind of thinking about how I would approach building a compliance program. So really the first step is really understanding your business model, your product, what industry you're in, your sales practices, and identifying the key risk areas. So understanding all the laws that apply, all the regulations. So whether it's FDA, FCA, AKS, thinking about sunshine possibly into the future if it's a new product, but really having somebody, whether it's internal or hiring somebody outside, to help you get a lay of the land from a compliance and legal risk perspective, because that's going to really drive a lot of your activity later. And then number 2, designating a compliance officer. So again, you can utilize outside counsel for this. You can hire a consultant. You can use an existing employee, even if it's somebody who's, taking the role on a part-time basis for the beginning, and then building out a compliance committee. And usually it's, when a company's starting out, it's a small company. And so it's pretty easy to designate who should be on the compliance committee. And that can always change as the company grows and matures. Number 3, I have complete a compliance assessment or a gap assessment. So what I would recommend is really sitting down with the 7 elements of an effective compliance program, using that kind of as a guide to begin. It'd probably be a compliance committee meeting where this is done, or the compliance officer would do it, and really kind of going through the checklist. What do we need to do? What can we kind of hit easy kind of at the beginning? And what's going to be a short or long-term goal for the compliance program? And that really all of this should be driven by the risk areas that apply in your business. And then implementing the key policies and procedures. So that's, drafting them, whether it's hiring somebody to help you draft them or to get templates as a starting point, but really based on, again, the number 1 on the slide, based on the laws and regulations that apply and your business practices, what policies and procedures do you want to put in place now? And then establishing kind of a rolling out cadence, because we find that it doesn't work necessarily as well when you implement, 15 policies at one time and then just roll them out and everybody signs them and agrees, but rather kind of having a cadence based on priority and risk, and then doing trainings and kind of having a cadence to roll those out can be more effective. All right. And we talked about culture a little bit already, and I think Sandra will talk about it a little bit more. But really embedding yourself within the business is something you want to start very early on. A lot of people joke about compliance being the sales prevention team, and you want to kind of prevent that by collaborating early on with stakeholders, building those partnerships so that they will come to you for guidance or questions early on when they're coming up with new programs, or if they have questions, so that you're not having to be the no man at the end of once they're trying to roll out a program. So really it's building trust. There's a lot of kind of interpersonal relationship concepts at play here. And so it's just kind of building those relationships, building trust, and then helping to meet the goals of the sales and marketing team and the business team, while staying within the bounds of what of the law and what the company accepts from a risk tolerance perspective. And then developing training programs. So this should be kind of done as you're rolling out the policies and procedures. It kind of makes sense that you'll roll out a policy, you'll have training of some sort, whether it's live training, which obviously these days is more difficult. But in my past, I had done a live training with every new sales rep. And it was like a monthly or bi-monthly training. And I actually really loved it. It's a great chance to, meet face-to-face, hand out, a card so that they can, contact me if they have questions. There's a lot of value in that live training, but it is difficult, obviously, to do these days, and just as, more reps and staff are kind of scattered throughout the country. But I think Sarah had mentioned at like the NSMs. So that's a really good opportunity to, be there, mingle, talk to people, and kind of just be visible. So for training, live training, if that's not an option for you, at least not for every new hire, you could do recorded videos, you could do webinars. I mean, a Zoom meeting like this, where at least you're having the face-to-face somewhat contact, and you're able to really kind of talk to them, get to know them, and then they have, having them be comfortable with you so that they'll come to you with questions, of course. And there's also e-learning. There's tons of great e-learning systems that you can utilize kind of in conjunction with any live or webinar training. And then thinking about kind of a compliance communications plan. A lot of companies that I've been part of, they'll have kind of a monthly theme that I really enjoy, that you can kind of have a regular cadence of a communication plan. So, you'll get an email with a video and kind of a little quiz every month based on the topic, and that you can adjust those topics based on, what are the hot industry trends? Maybe it's speaker programs. So kind of focusing on those things. And it's kind of a fun, interactive way to continue that compliance conversation without having to sit and have a live training, so that it doesn't, feel so much like a training, but really just having that communication open door policy. And then the hotline. So that's kind of an easy one to get checked off early on. A lot of companies will start with like an email box, obviously not ideal in the sense that you may not be able to report anonymously, but it might be a good option for those just starting out who are, still looking into, some sort of a vendor or a voicemail line that they could use. There's lots of vendors out there that have online reporting capabilities, and you can also call in. So I'd encourage you to look into those. And then as you kind of develop, initially, you'll probably just have one compliance officer or even a part-time compliance officer, but thinking towards defining the budget and headcount needs. And this will obviously evolve as the company evolves, and will, of course, the enforcement environment will affect that as well. And Sandra will talk more about maintaining the compliance program, but you never are really done with the compliance program. It's a continual, it's continuously adapting. We're modifying, we're making changes. There's policies and procedure changes that are kind of ongoing. So it is something that you can set up, but it's never really complete because it's a journey. It's a compliance journey. All right, and we talked a little bit, I think it was Sarah and Brent that talked a little bit about culture. I mean, of course, this is a big piece of it. We want to promote a culture of compliance. This starts with senior leadership. We want them to, give lip service to compliance, starting maybe, town halls with the slide on compliance, or their commitment to compliance, or ending calls, ending business meetings with a reminder of the code of conduct. Really just promoting shared responsibility and a commitment to compliance, and also holding, their direct reports accountable for compliance, so that it's not just, the staff, it is everybody throughout the organization that has accountability for compliance. Compliance function, of course, should be visible. All right, so we talked a little bit about kind of the logistics and steps with setting up a compliance program. And now we're going to focus a little bit more on performing investigations. So these are internal investigations. I think Dulcie will talk a little bit more about enforcement investigation, but this is focusing more on internal investigations. And a lot of people get a little nervous when they're thinking about investigations because it's kind of a scary word. But they're kind of fun. You get to put your detective hat on a little bit, but essentially, I would just say they're normal, they're common, they will happen. So you want to be prepared for them. And the government would expect you to, you're going to get some trigger events that will require an investigation. And so you want to be prepared and have a policy, a process before you need it, just so you're not scrambling to try to figure out what to do. So kind of just at a high level, again, you want to be prepared before you need a policy on investigations. And it doesn't have to be like incredibly detailed down to names and time, it doesn't have to be incredibly detailed, but at least having a general idea of what will happen if we get a trigger that requires an investigation. What does the process look like? What do we need to document? Who's involved? So a lot of people assume that really investigations are triggered only by hotline reports, which a lot of them are, but really investigations could be triggered by any number of things or communications. So it could be something you heard in a meeting or in a hallway conversation, a report, obviously. An enforcement agency may contact you. It may be an audit finding, whether internal or if it's an FDA finding, routine monitoring. If you're looking through expense reports and you notice something that that flags your attention, that could essentially trigger an investigation. A lawsuit may be brought. You could get a complaint, whether from a customer or a patient or a competitor even. So just kind of keep in mind that the scope of what could trigger an investigation is broader than just the hotline. All right, so then initiating the report. So really the first thing I do, so we'll kind of pretend that we get a report through our hotline and it's in writing and it's anonymous. So first thing we want to do is really read it, understand it, kind of parse it out, then look at kind of figure out what the issues or what the allegations are. So look at, is it a known observation? Is it a repeat issue? Have you done training on this recently? And that's what maybe prompted the question. What is the risk level? Are we looking at, a policy violation or a process violation, or are we looking at more of a potentially criminal issue? Are there industry trends? Is it related to speaker programs, for example, or recent prosecutions or settlements that touched on it? You can assess the credibility initially, how it's written. Does it seem to be credible? Are they using inflammatory language that appears to be targeting a certain person? These are all things you'll want to just kind of think about as you're conducting the initial assessment. And if you have the identity, most of them I'd say are anonymous, but not all. Some will provide their name. But if it is, if you do have the name, figure out, is it an employee? Who is it? How long have they been there? What function are they in? And then just lastly, are they making allegations that would prompt us to stop or start doing anything right now, or pause while we are investigating? So again, that kind of goes back to the nature of the allegation, and it will obviously be different decision for each report that's investigated. All right, so who should investigate? So most companies want to try to keep their investigations under attorney-client privilege or work product privilege, understandably. I'd encourage you to kind of consider that before you initiate the investigation, just to make sure that you're in a good spot in terms of cementing any privileges. Involve counsel, whether it's in-house or outside, at the very beginning. So like the minute you get the report, the compliance officer if should be contacting counsel to potentially initiate an investigation. But it's key to have an investigation be conducted at the direction of and under the supervision of a lawyer for the purpose of obtaining legal advice. And so that's critical. It can't be business advice. It should be legal advice as the significant purpose. And again, communication should be kept totally confidential related to the investigation. There may be some considerations for using outside counsel for investigations. There may be, depending on the allegation, there may be conflicts, bias. There may be sensitive issues or individuals kind of called out in the allegation. Also, some companies just don't have the time, the resources, the capabilities to conduct an investigation. I know I've conducted many for clients, and it's just a matter of, just not having the time to dedicate to it, or having somebody who's more independent, which is really valuable. You may consider engaging outside experts or consultants, and you'll want to think about how you do that to preserve privilege if that comes up. Carefully scoping the investigation so that it's not too broad, but it's also not too narrow, such that you'll miss, some tangential issue. All right. And then assembling the investigations team. So of course, depending on the allegation, it should be a small team, obviously, just who needs to be involved. But depending on the nature of the allegation, it may vary. So there may be HR, legal, maybe finance, obviously keeping them in kind of the scope of the privilege. All right. So once you have kind of the complaints assessed, you have the team situated, you're performing an investigation at the direction of an attorney for the purpose of obtaining legal advice, you'll want to start diving into the documents. And so this sometimes can be a process depending on the allegation, of course. You'll want to start requesting records from your business partners, whether it's email keyword searches, whether it's sales reports, sales data, trending. There may be, documents, there may be sign-in sheets or expense reports. A lot of them seem to involve expense reports, which is tedious work, but it actually is very informative because you can kind of dig through and map out kind of a calendar of when expenses were incurred on certain dates to kind of get deep into the weeds on the details. You may use internet searching. I have used social media on many occasions in investigations. Just when certain people are named and you're looking kind of for background information, it is helpful. Obviously not relying on their social media posts, but just getting as much information as you can about those that are involved in the investigation is helpful. Especially if it's like a specific doctor or a practice, you can do some research on the history of that practice, see if there's been any issues in the past, that kind of thing. In some cases, you may need to get kind of expert help from a document review or financial review perspective. So just keep in mind that you may opt to hire a computer forensics expert or a financial auditor if the need arises and if the risk level is such that becomes necessary. All right, so you've assessed your report, you've done all the document review that you can, which actually it's tedious again, and it does take a lot of time. I don't want to downplay that, but there will be a point where you will want to start talking to people. So typically, if you have the name of the reporter, that would be, one of the first people that you speak with, but not always. And as you're going through the document review, you'll want to note down kind of names of who you'll want to talk to at the company, and then consider always interviewing their manager or people that they work with as well. But the list will likely change or grow as you proceed with your investigation. So also consider the order of interviews. So, you may choose not to interview the reporter first. Maybe you want to interview somebody else, just based on the strategy of what you want to ask and how you want to go about the interview. So prepare specific questions, be clear on how you want to ask them. When you're talking to them, you want to be clear on who the client is, consider the upjohn warnings. You want to be clear that you are not their counsel, that they have the ability to obtain their own counsel. These are all just very important key aspects of speaking with an interviewee. And I know we're at time, so I think I have just a couple more slides I'll go through quickly. So we talked about this already, but just making sure that you're very careful with your communications and documentation, marking everything as privileged. Again, noting in the documents that there was counsel involvement and you've initiated the investigation to obtain legal advice. Typically, there's some sort of a final report or memorandum that's prepared, and then we will talk briefly about reporting out. So you get to the end, you have a report, you're going to have to share it with people that need to know the information. So that's typically not, the entire senior staff. It is typically the executive team or a very small, a number of executive team members or the board. This will vary based on the nature of the allegation. Just consider timing, method, the manner, the audience, privilege considerations, confidentiality. We want to protect the reporter. So, not disclosing the name of the reporter in the report out is a good practice. And reports are not always substantiated, but there may be times where the report may not be substantiated, but you still want to take corrective actions or mitigating measures just to kind of prevent issues that come up in the future. All right. And my last slide is just thinking about things that may happen after an investigation. So you decide to take corrective action. It could be disciplinary, it could be repayment, it could be disclosure, whether voluntary or mandatory. You'll want to involve SEC counsel if you need to, of course, prior to disclosing to investors or public, if that's applicable. You may just update compliance training, do retraining, updating policies and procedures. And then also just depending on the nature of the allegation, of course, and the risk level, consider whether to engage, whether and when to engage somebody that could help with white collar crime defense. All right, and that is all I have. Sorry, I ran a little bit late here. I'll pass it back to you, Mary.
Thanks, and thanks for wrapping that up, Amanda, but you've got good stuff, so we wanted to hear it too. All right, so our next session features Sandra Cito of Cardiovascular Systems, Inc. She's going to be speaking on our next step, managing compliance. So Sandra is the Chief Compliance Officer at CSI. She's responsible for managing the company's ethics and compliance program, and that included implementing a corporate integrity agreement. Sandra has over 25 years of experience as a lawyer and compliance professional, including being a partner at Dorsey & Whitney LLP and as an in-house attorney and deputy compliance officer at Medtronic. So with that, take it away, Sandra.
Thank you, Mary. Appreciate the opportunity. Today, I'm going to talk about what do you do once you've got that program built. Amanda went through and talked about the 7 elements. So the next step is, what do you need to do to make sure it's not just a paper program? So first slide, please. So as Amanda talked about, there are, known 7 elements of an effective compliance program. I'm not going to go through each of those elements in detail, but let's say you've got a program built. What do you do now? And that's what we're going to talk about today. Next slide. So this has been mentioned before. Compliance programs are never static. They must evolve. It's just a requirement. First off, the compliance landscape is always changing. Just as Mark and Dulcie talked about the new fraud guidance that came out, or fraud alert that came out in November on speakers programs, things like that happen all the time. It's your responsibility as heading up a compliance program is to make sure you keep up with those current cases and guidance. I find doing that, there's a couple of ways that I do it. One is I work with knowledgeable counsel, so folks that are really steeped in this and are following it probably more closely than I am. Also joining industry or compliance associations, MDMA, AvaMed in the medical device industry, our pharma for the pharma industry. Those are just examples. We get great information from those associations. There's also compliance associations like HCCA and SCCA, which are located here in Minneapolis. Those are more focused on compliance in general, compliance programs in general, but again, great resource if you're looking for information. Mark also mentioned things like Law 360. They give email updates every day. Those are a great resource as well. Even if you don't subscribe, you can get free emails. They give you a lot of information. For me, it's really, I look at them and I say, gosh, what's happening today? What's going on? And then if I want to delve into it more, I find other resources to help me figure it out. But again, it's a great way to know just what's happening out there. And also know that your compliance program has to evolve because your business is always going to change. You're going to have to continue to redesign your program to fit your business, whether it's new products that are being offered, whether it's new markets or geographies that you're going into, things will always change. And as a compliance professional, the goal is to always stay ahead of those changes. So get yourself invited to meetings so that you know what's happening and what's going to be happening in your business. The other thing that I like to do is I like to create allies in the business. Those are folks that I know are in some of those meetings that I might not be in, but it's just one of those things if you can check in with them every once in a while and just say, hey, what's happening in your world? Tell me about what's going on. What's new in marketing? What's new in sales? It's a great way to keep in touch with how the business is evolving. And it also is a way that you can kind of multiply yourself. If you create those allies in the business, folks that you can talk to on a regular basis and that you trust, then they can be your eyes and ears. They can come to you when they see issues or have other questions. And then the other thing that I think that compliance professionals learn is that getting good at designing processes is really important. Because a lot of these processes, so for example, if you talk about speaker programs and picking speakers for speaker programs, get involved in designing the process for how speakers are selected so that you can then insert those compliance elements into that process so that you're creating a situation where you're kind of doing your work up front as opposed to trying to clean up messes on the back end. Next slide. You know, I always say that the biggest thing that I can do as a compliance professional in an organization is creating that credibility around compliance. And there's a few ways that you can do that. One is that you really need to focus on creating an ethical culture. It's not just rules. It's not a paper program. You just can't put rules out there and processes out there and say, oh, it's going to work just fine. You want to make sure that you've got folks thinking about what is the right thing to do. So when I talk about ethical culture, I mean partnering with your HR group to make sure that there's trainings on ethics. Partner with your HR group to make sure that there's discussion about doing the right thing. Making sure your code of conduct is written in a way so that folks understand what are the do's and the don'ts. And it's not all about rules. I do training with monthly training with all of our new employees that come through the organization. And the only message I want them to walk away with from that training is that we can put all sorts of policies out there. We can have all sorts of rules that handle things, but we're never going to be able to cover every situation that arises in the day-to-day work environment. And that's where it becomes very important for each individual, each employee to understand that they have an obligation to fill in those ethical gaps with their good decision-making, with their good moral compass. And that's really what I'm talking about when I talk about creating an ethical culture. The other thing is you really need to focus on your risks. You've heard other folks talk about this, and as it was mentioned during my introduction, CSI did go through a CIA. We just finished it, 5 years. It's a long time, but I will tell you that any interaction I had with our OIG monitor, everything always came down to where are the risks in your business and what are you doing about those high risk areas. So an annual compliance risk assessment is a must-have. You must go through and assess your business and say, where are our greatest vulnerabilities? And then what you do after that risk assessment is you design plans around it for the key or emerging risks. So you figure out what your training plan is going to be around those risks. You train to the areas that are higher risk. You do more training with your sales force because they're probably your greatest risk. You do your monitoring associated with those risks. And then there's something that somebody once wiser than me once said to me about compliance is that focus on what the business pays and what the business says. So what does that mean? What the business pays is those interactions where we're paying a consultant, those interactions where we're paying for travel, those interactions where we're paying for a meal. Those are areas of focus that you need to look at very closely. When we talk about says, that is, what are we saying about our products? So what are our ad promo materials look like? What are our reps saying in the field when they're out? So those are the two kind of touchstones that I think about when I'm assessing risks. I'm looking at those interactions where we're paying somebody, where there's some kind of transfer of value, or that we're actually talking about our products. That's the way that I look at risk in our business. And then the other thing to build credibility is really making sure that you build relationships at all levels. You need to make sure that your board is bought in if you're able to have access to the board. You need to make sure that your executive management is bought in. You do that probably through your compliance committee. Here at CSI, we have quarterly meetings with our executive team where we do an hour-long meeting that talks about just compliance and is one of those meetings that everybody attends, nobody's traveling, and we just sit down and talk about things. We talk about the state of the business, we talk about what's happening in the compliance enforcement environment, and frankly, our best discussions at those compliance committee meetings relate to some of the cases that you heard Mark and Dulcie talk about earlier today, because folks do like to understand what's going on, and they do like to understand what other companies are doing so that we can avoid those mistakes. The other thing I always want to say is that if I say I'm going to do something, if compliance says they're going to do it, then do it, and do it when you said you were going to do it. Make sure that you have that credibility built. Communicate your value proposition of compliance all the time. It's not something that people have as top of mind. It's something that they need to be reminded about. You heard about a lot of that in the prior presentations, why compliance is so important. You know, we want to be able to focus on our mission of serving our patients. We want to be able to promote our products effectively. We don't want to be dealing with investigations. It's just one of those things that, again, not top of mind. You just need to make sure that people understand what is the value of compliance so that they actually will think about compliance in situations where they need to. And, you know, my frame of reference is always a yes, we will figure it out mentality. You know, somebody talked about compliance as being the sales prevention department. That's exactly what you don't want. So many times I've been in conversations with folks, they'll come to me and say, I want to do X. And it's probably not something we want them to do. But then the question becomes, what are you trying to accomplish by doing X? What is it that, you know, the business is trying to do? What are you trying to move forward from a business perspective? And that usually opens up a broader conversation to say, oh, you want to do that? Okay, well, here's some other ways that you'll be able to do it. I find that is a great way to build credibility with folks if they know that you are not going to just have that knee-jerk reaction and say, no, you can't do that, and really try and work with them. The last thing is I try to create what I call ambassadors, compliance ambassadors at all levels. I talked about this before in terms of, you know, getting those folks that are in marketing, in sales, other folks that are, you know, in other meetings that you can't be in. That's what I mean by ambassadors. Those are the folks that'll be potentially asking compliance questions, even if you're not in the room, because you'll have them trained to start thinking that way, to say, hey, what does this mean for the business from a compliance perspective? So again, if you can get those ambassadors, it's really, really helpful. Next slide. One thing I'm not necessarily personally very good at is creating structure, but compliance programs do need structure. A standard cadence is your friend. Plan out your reoccurring work on an annual calendar basis. Now, as a company who's just gone through a CIA, we had to do that because we had to do annual reports to the government for 5 years. We had to get certain things done by a certain time period in order to complete those annual reports. So it was pretty easy. But again, it's just a great practice to fall into and make sure that you're doing it. And design plans for everything. Make sure you've got an annual training plan. Make sure you've got an annual monitoring plan. Make sure you've got a risk assessment plan, as I talked about, and just plan things out and say potentially, okay, in my first Q1, I'm going to have my training, monitoring, risk assessment plans done, but I might execute my training plan over all 4 quarters. I might execute my monitoring plan over all 4 quarters. I might do my risk assessment in Q3. Just as I said, just plan it all out so that you know what you're going to do when. I also highly recommend creating an operations manual. And what I mean by that is putting down pen to paper in terms of what are the processes you follow, what are the cadence of events that you do, things like that. Unfortunately, we just had a person leave our organization, and I will tell you the operations manual was so helpful because a lot of times with compliance, people keep a lot of the things up in their head. They don't write it down on paper. So then when you have a transition, you aren't able to easily transfer that information. If you create that operations manual, if you put pen to paper, then you will have it. As I like to say, you know, if I win the lottery tomorrow and decide to retire, I want this program to continue. I don't want everything to be, you know, stuck up in my head. So that's number one, I think is a great thing. Also, you know, as somebody once told me, if the government comes knocking on your door, if you don't have things documented, they're not going to believe that you've done it. So you need to document everything your program does. Part of that is the operations manual. Part of it is your annual plans, your training plans, monitoring plans. You really just need to make sure that you have that documentation in the event that you get a knock on the door. It's also really good to have that documentation so that you can kind of just review with your compliance committee and or your board. Here's all the things we did this year. Here were our objectives. Here's all the things we accomplished. It's a great PR move. Another thing you need to think about is your systems and IT and make them your friend. Automate anything you can do. For example, we have a process, a needs assessment process whenever we engage an HCP consultant. We have figured out a way to automate that so that it all used to, when I first started here 6 years ago, it all used to be paper and people would sign paper. Now we've got it automated, so it's all done on an automated system. It's not something that happens overnight, but just again, work toward that. Make sure that your compliance program data is stored centrally, accessible by those who need it. Again, this relates to making sure that you can have smooth transitions if you have people leave. It makes it so that if anybody is doing an investigation, they can find information that might be relevant, such as monitoring records or things like that. I would also say choose credible vendors. Just ask people who's got the best e-learning trainings for compliance, who's got the best contract management system, all of those things that you need. You'll be able to get those, get references, and then it makes your job a lot easier when you're trying to then select a particular venue. And then the other thing I like to do from a business perspective, we're a small company, so a lot of times systems are designed and created and bought by other departments in our organization. I like to talk to folks and say, hey, if our guys are ever going to be doing this system, here's some data that I'd like. Think about, will you come talk to me when you're building this system? So for example, we just implemented Salesforce.com for our sales team. It's going to be a treasure trove of information that I've wanted from our compliance program for a long time. And we have been intimately involved with figuring out what data we can get from that new Salesforce system. It's just an example of working across functions, make sure that folks know what you need from a compliance perspective. And I will tell you, people come back to you sometimes and said, hey, you told me about a year ago that you were looking for this kind of data. Well, finance is also doing something here. I think I can get you that data that way. I've been very successful in getting things done with other people's money in ways like that. Next slide. And this relates to the point I just made. Compliance programs are always lean. You're never going to have all the resources you want to run a compliance program. That's where you need to get creative with your budget, get creative with quote unquote your people. I like to say that I have part-time FTEs in a lot of different departments here at CSI, and it's true, I do. We also try here to push out to the business any work that we can. So I mentioned before, we've got a process for HCP engagement. That now is run by a medical education group because most of our HCP engagements come through our medical education group. Do what you can to push out processes. We, for example, here at CSI, do not do the sunshine reporting. That is done by the finance organization with our help and our oversight. They run our expense system, Concur, so they're the ones who are best able to gather all that data. Again, try and get creative, use those other FTEs and other departments when you can, because you're not going to have enough people in your compliance department. Next slide. So I just want to talk now, switch gears a little bit and talk about a couple of watchouts related to some of the 7 elements. These are things that I've learned over time. And it really, again, are things that I think about to make sure that we're not just running a paper compliance program, we're really running an effective compliance program. Policies. Don't use legalese in your policies. Use plain English. Make sure people can understand them. Make them readily available. If you have an intranet site, make sure they're available on the intranet site so people can search them. I also say, if you can, don't use just read and acknowledge for training on those policies. Make sure that there's FAQs. Make sure that there's other things that folks can just pick up and read and say, oh, that's what you mean by this policy, or this is what this policy is trying to accomplish. I'm big on trying to give people the big picture from a compliance perspective, as opposed to the minutia. And my goal is always to say to folks, here's the big picture, here's things, you be the issue spotter. And then when you have questions, here's the resources that you can go to get those questions answered. I find that to be very effective in my organization. For training, I think Amanda already touched on this, but get creative. Use things other than PowerPoints or e-learnings. Create a campaign to get your message across multiple times in different channels over a set period. So, and I'll tell you, this is not something that you're probably going to do the first year of your compliance program. This is going to be something you evolve to over time. But what we've been trying to do here is, especially with our sales organization, is create kind of a theme for a month or quarter and say, this is the topic we're going to talk about. We put out a newsletter that covers that topic. And on the front page of the newsletter, we've got information that is relevant from a policy perspective. Here's the things you need to know. And typically on the backside are kind of a Q&A. And what we try and do is we try and show scenarios of where people have gotten in trouble in that particular area, to try and show folks, here's some day-to-day things you need to think about or that you might run across, and here's ways that you can avoid it. So that's our goal. But we put out the newsletter, and then we supplement that with other emails. We supplement it with other trainings. We supplement it with other messaging. So for example, Sarah mentioned going to the national sales meeting. It might be something where we then supplement at the national sales meeting additional training on that particular topic. And I want to put a plug in for whatever you can do to get out into the business and meet people. I don't know about you guys, but my experience as a compliance professional is that when people see your name on the phone, when you're calling them, they're usually pretty scared. They're trying to figure out, why is the compliance officer calling me? I want to get to know people personally as much as I can, so that they don't have that fear, that they know that they can talk to me and they can relate to me and relate to anybody on my team. Again, going to the national sales meeting, sitting down and having a drink with somebody and just talking with them is a great way to make sure that you build that relationship. And that's really, really important. Getting back to training, the last thing is whatever you can do to tailor it to a job function, do it. People hate getting training if they say, I will never, ever need this information. So whatever you can do to tailor it, please do it, because you'll get more credibility from the organization, people in the organization, because when they see that training, they'll know it's important. And it's not just, oh yeah, it's another policy, I got to train on this. Next slide. Communication channels. For me, this is, again, trying to figure out how to create that open door policy so that folks feel comfortable coming to you. And frankly, it doesn't have to be you. It can be your legal department. It can be your HR department. It can be other executives. The message I always try and get out to the organization is that if you need to ask questions, you can go to anybody. You don't have to come to the compliance officer. But also make sure that you publicize your hotline in many ways, many times. I find that's very effective, because then folks feel that there is an open door culture in your organization. They feel like they can raise issues if they know that matters that go to the hotline will be addressed. Monitoring and auditing. As I mentioned, whatever monitoring and auditing you do, tie it to your risk assessment. Only look at the areas that are really your highest risk areas. Don't focus on the mundane stuff. It's just a lot of make work. Just focus on your high risk areas. And then I always like to understand what we're trying to do. Then you look for data sources. A lot of people do it the opposite way and say, what data can I get? So therefore, what can I monitor? In my opinion, that's not being very effective. I think what you need to do is figure out what your overall plan is from your risk assessment. You need to figure out what areas you want to look at, and then you figure out where you can get those data sources. As I mentioned, sometimes that takes time. Sometimes you have to rely on other departments. For example, I'm relying on the sales organization to implement Salesforce to get a lot of the data that I wanted for the last 5 years. But it's finally happening, and it's gonna be great when I get it. And then again, the other reminder, as I mentioned before, focus on what we pay and what we say. Focus on those interactions where there's transfers of value, and focus on those interactions where there's transfers of information. Next slide. And then lastly, this is my last slide, responding to issues. It's really important that you have an overall picture of what's happening from a compliance perspective. To know if trends exist from your hotline calls, from your investigations, looking at other government enforcement actions. That's where you kind of synthesize all the information together. For those of you in the FDA world, it's sort of like a CAPA response. You figure out what the problem is, you figure out what the root cause is, and then you figure out what the solution should be. I always try to determine root cause of an issue. Sometimes that's hard, but to the extent that you can do it, it's really helpful, because then you can pinpoint what do you need to do to try and fix it so that issue doesn't happen again. As you've heard before, you need to be consistent in terms of discipline. Ask what we've done before in this situation, and make sure that you're consistent in terms of what your response is to any particular investigation or any particular issue. The other thing that's challenging about this is you really need to publicize what you can when you can do it. So that means if you've had an investigation, there's been disciplinary action, to the extent that you can publicize that in the rest of the organization, it's really helpful for a couple of reasons. Number one, especially in my organization, there was a lot of fear when we started our CIA, and folks were very concerned that if they made one little misstep, for example, if they had one meal over the meal limit, they were going to get fired. We had to do a lot of education to make sure that folks understood that that wasn't the case, that it really was, we were looking at the facts and circumstances of each situation, and that one meal overage wasn't going to get you fired. So a good way to do that is to publicize those cases when you can. Sometimes I find that I have to have a lag in between the time period of when we do the investigation, when we close it, and when we publicize it. Wait 6 months, a year, so then folks don't necessarily say, oh yeah, that happened to John Smith. Oh, now I know why he got fired. So again, it's one of those things that it's kind of a tension point with your HR folks. They really don't want you to publicize things, but to the extent that you can and get it out in a generic way that you don't necessarily identify particular employees, it's really, really helpful to make sure that number one, folks understand what are big issues and issues that would cause true disciplinary action. And number two, it's also a learning exercise so that folks can avoid those issues. And then as, again, the last piece of it, it is really kind of a circle. You go through, you do your investigation, you figure out what the root cause is, and then you reassess what needs to change in your compliance program. What are we missing? Did we miss training in a particular area? Do we have to have a new policy or a change in a policy in an area? Do we need to do more monitoring in an area? So again, it's that loop, and you need to close that loop when you finish an investigation. Next slide. That is all I have today. I'm very happy to take any questions if any folks have any. But again, your goal here in managing a compliance program is to make sure you bring it to life in your organization, to make sure it's not a paper program, and make sure that you've got the rest of your organization bought in that compliance is important. Thank you very much.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much for that, Sandra. Looks like we are ready for our next break. We'll return at 11 o'clock with 2 final presentations. So we'll see you in about 15 minutes. Welcome back. We're about 2/3 of the way through our program, and joining us next is Fredrikson's Dulce Foster for her second feature. Since we've already introduced her, I'm going to let her dive right in. Dulce?
Thanks very much, Mary. I am happy to be here. Good morning. Since this presentation is only half an hour long, it's going to be pretty high level discussion about what to do when you're responding to a government investigation. I'm only going to hit some of the most important things to be done. For any white collar attorneys or even experienced criminal defendants in the audience, this is going to seem like familiar territory, but I'm hoping that for the rest of you, it'll be new and informative. So next slide. What I've created here is a checklist of things to consider when you find yourself on the wrong end of a government investigation. So this is part one. Part one is just the first steps to consider. These are the things that you're going to need to go to immediately when a government investigation hits you. And now I'll go through each of these steps in details. Next slide. So as a threshold matter, it's important that you read the signs. And what I mean by that is just know when you are under investigation. Now, this may seem obvious to many of you. I know when I'm under investigation. And of course, it is obvious when a truckload of FBI agents shows up at your door with a search warrant and starts taking your computers out. But what about the rest of the time? There are many, many different ways that government investigations can begin. One of the most common ways is the dreaded grand jury subpoena. When you get a grand jury subpoena, it's often difficult to know how to read the tea leaves, to know what's going on. You may be just a witness. You might be a third party that is in possession of documents that the government wants. Or you may be a target, or you may fall into this middle category that the government likes to call subjects. These are organizations and individuals where the government hasn't really made up its mind yet about which bucket they're going to put you into. So it might be very unclear, even to the prosecutors who are involved, which bucket you fall into and whether you're a target of that investigation. It's important to consult with white collar criminal defense counsel, FCA litigation counsel when you get something like this, so that you can help them, or so that they can help you figure out what's going on. Another common way that government investigations begin is through civil investigative demands. These are tools that assistant U.S. attorneys use and leverage when they are conducting investigations. Earlier in this morning's session, I talked about this period of time between when a False Claims Act whistleblower files a complaint under seal and the government is considering whether or not to intervene in the case. And they will do their own investigation of what's going on. Oftentimes, a company won't know that the case exists because it is filed under seal, but they will find out when they get a civil investigative demand from the government asking for information so that they can explore the allegations that a whistleblower has made. So that is one common way that these investigations begin, and one common way that companies find out that they are in fact under investigation. They can also begin with federal agencies or state attorneys general who may issue subpoenas. These agencies often work together with the Department of Justice. So you might get a subpoena from an OIG, or you might get a subpoena from a state attorney general and not realize that there's also a Department of Justice lawyer kind of lurking in the background, listening to what's going on, watching what's going on, and deciding how to proceed. As we've talked about many times during this session today, you can be the subject of a False Claims Act complaint, either a direct complaint from the federal government or a key TAM whistleblower complaint through a relator. Understand that it is really common nowadays, that I think more so than it used to be, for these cases, these False Claims Act cases, to be run in tandem with criminal investigations. So it's often the case that a company will initially start out understanding that they are the subject or target of a False Claims Act complaint, and then find out that the federal government is also looking into whether or not to bring criminal charges. They've gotten much, much better. The criminal and civil divisions of the Department of Justice have gotten much, much better about coordinating with each other on these things and sharing information than they used to be. You can learn about the fact that you're under investigation from other intelligence sources. So just the general rumor mill, the grapevine, your sales reps might hear about something in the field. You might read news reports that suggest that there are some red flags that you need to look at. There might be social media posts. There might even be an industry sweep that affects everybody in your particular area of practice, in your industry, that might raise a red flag for you to take a look and see if it's possible that you might be under investigation. Another way is these informal requests that you might get from government agents or lawyers that ask you to provide information or to meet with them to discuss a matter. And it's kind of hard to know sometimes how to interpret things like that. It might be a simple administrative matter that you can clear up just by going to meet with that lawyer and talking to them. I think everyone here on this call knows how important it is to be cooperative with the FDA and to keep the lines of communication open with that agency. But you should always be aware that it could be something much more serious. And it's often difficult to tell. If the agent mentions criminal liability, or if the allegations are particularly serious, if the tone of the meeting seems to be hostile, if they try to bring other government agencies to the table, or if it just feels wrong, just take a step back and stop and consider getting outside counsel, and consider the possibility that you might be under investigation. Next slide. So it's important not to be misled. You need to know who is on the other side of the table. So if a government agent or a government attorney asks you to attend a meeting, it's really important. If this is somebody that you don't know, if it's an individual that you haven't worked with in the past, find out. This may seem like an obvious thing, but it's not always obvious. And I've got a recent example that I can talk about. Fairly sophisticated, publicly traded medical device company. So we're not talking about a mom and pop shop. This was a big company, had an audit that they were undergoing, and they got a call from a government lawyer who said, I'd like to meet with you. And they set that meeting up, and they agreed to go, and everything was all ready to go. And they didn't notify their outside counsel until the night before this meeting was supposed to take place. They called their attorney and they said to her, yeah, we've got this meeting taking place. And she said, well, who's the lawyer that you're going to be meeting with? And they said, oh, I don't know. I think it might be somebody from the Department of Justice. And all the bells and whistles and red flags started going off. And she said, who do you think it is? And they started doing some due diligence. And turns out that the person on the other side of the table was not only an assistant U.S. attorney who was looking at the case, but it was a prosecutor from the criminal division. The client was in a bit of denial, was saying, no, it can't be possible that we're under criminal investigation. This is just an audit. We were going to clear it up. It ended up taking about 5 lawyers in 2 different law firms of meetings with the client to convince them that no, they really should not go to this meeting. And so the meeting was canceled. The lawyer for the company ended up connecting with the DOJ attorney, the assistant U.S. attorney on the other side of the table, and confirmed that in fact that company was under criminal investigation. Had they not stopped and paused and stopped going to that meeting, they may have made some very serious admissions against their interests and damaged their criminal defenses in the case. So really important to know who you're meeting with. Next slide. Okay, so this is something nobody really wants to think about or talk about, search warrants. Nobody wants to think it's going to happen to them, but really nothing can be more disruptive or cause more panic in an organization. So I think these situations deserve special attention. And even if you're certain that it's never going to happen to you, it really pays to have a basic, at least a rudimentary understanding of what to do if you're faced with a search warrant, because if it does happen, you are not going to have time to think about what to do at the time. It's going to be all panic and chaos. So here are some basic pointers for responding to search warrants. First of all, allow access to the premises and then get out of the way. You don't want to be, locking your doors and telling them not to come in or doing anything that could be interpreted by the government as obstruction of justice. Be polite and professional, but do not answer any questions. They have a very common approach where they bring a whole bunch of agents in and just fan out in an organization and start asking as many questions as they can before the company can get their lawyer on board. Don't let that happen. Make sure that you are not answering questions at the time. You can unlock file cabinets in offices, but don't provide computer or phone passwords. This could be a waiver of the Fifth Amendment privilege against self-incrimination. The decision to provide passwords and computer access that's a discussion that you need to have with your outside criminal defense lawyer before you do it. You should immediately contact your outside attorney, or if you don't have one, find one, and have them come on site while the search is ongoing so that they can run interference with the government agents for you. Ask for a copy of the search warrant and the inventory so that you know what they've taken and that you confirm that the warrant is actually real and proper. Identify potentially privileged materials that they might be taking, and your lawyer should do this and for you. Object to the seizure of any attorney-client privilege materials, and if they've already been taken, then your lawyer can talk to the prosecutor who's involved and ask to have those privileged materials returned. Now, this could be a lengthy discussion that they'll have. The DOJ often, and one of the mechanisms that they commonly use in situations like this is called a taint team. And this is, they'll say, it's kind of a fiction. They'll have the attorneys who are prosecuting the case and the agents who are investigating the case, and they'll set up kind of a Chinese wall between them and the another part of the office. And they'll say that these agents and these attorneys on the other side of the office can look at all of the documents and materials on the computer and return the privileged information. This has been routine for years for the Department of Justice to use this process, but recently courts have been calling this process into question, and defense attorneys and defendants have been challenging this process as unfair and potentially biased. And there was a 2019 Fourth Circuit case where the court came down and said, no, the taint team process can't be used here. So there are other ways that privilege review can happen. One way, and I've seen the government agree to it on maybe one occasion, is to ask that the attorneys for the company be allowed to review the computer information and hand over any documents that are not privileged. So give us the computers back, we'll look at it, we'll give you everything that's not privileged. The government often objects to that process, so I haven't seen it done a whole lot, but it has worked in some cases. Another process would be to ask that the court who's involved, there's always a court behind a grand jury subpoena, appoint a special master to review the computer and determine what's privileged and what's not. When the agents are on your premises, consider closing for the day and sending your employees home so that they don't get targeted for some of these interviews that the agents are going to be asking for. You do want to tell your employees that they should not interfere with the government agents, and you should warn them against deleting or destroying any records. When, sometimes people panic and they're like, oh no, I've got some bad information on my files. Those agents are at the door. I'm going to delete everything. That could cause real problems. And I'll talk about that in a bit. But an immediate message to the employees: don't be obstructive. Don't try to destroy stuff. You should not instruct your employees not to talk to the agents if they want to. Telling your employees that they're not allowed to talk to the government agents, again, could be interpreted as obstruction of justice. You can tell them that the decision whether to be interviewed or not is up to them. It's entirely the employee's decision. You should tell them if they do decide to talk to government agents, no matter what they do, they should tell the truth. Those untruths have a way of getting out. And if you're liable for what your employees do. And if your employees lie to government agents, then the company is lying to the government agents. You can request that company counsel be present for employee interviews, and you can offer to bring in separate counsel to represent the employees individually. Next slide. So what if you're not being searched? When do you bring in outside counsel? If you're being searched, it's pretty obvious. Bring in counsel immediately. If not, how do you make that judgment call? I think a lot of that depends on and I think Sandra talked about this a little bit, it depends on the sophistication of the in-house legal team. It depends on the bandwidth of the in-house legal team. And it also depends on the seriousness of the issues that are involved. It may make sense for you to handle the issue on your own if your team is used to handling government subpoenas and if you're pretty sure that you're just a witness. If the government employee is somebody that you regularly work with at the agency and the questions being asked are routine, you probably don't need to bring in your outside lawyer. But if it's something serious, if it's threatening, if it's hostile, if it appears that you have criminal exposure, absolutely bring in an outside attorney right away. I have, in counseling clients over the years, found that it is often the instinct of, particularly in the medical device and pharma space, to cooperate and to say, well, I want to appear cooperative. I don't want to bring in a lawyer because that's going to make me look defensive. But and so I've encountered lots of clients who are concerned that bringing in a lawyer from the outside will send the wrong message. But the problem is, if you let your cooperative instinct run amok, you could end up getting yourself in a situation where you incriminate yourself, and that is far worse. You need to understand that retaining a lawyer is not in itself evidence of guilt, and that the Department of Justice is used to seeing lawyers on the other side of the table, even for routine third-party document subpoenas. I handle those all the time. It's not a big deal to have a lawyer running interference for you. If the questions that you're getting are coming from the Office of the Inspector General, consider bringing in outside counsel. An OIG investigation could be a prelude to a false claims or a criminal case, and as I mentioned before, the Department of Justice might already be silently monitoring what's going on. And it really is a mistake to try to handle things internally if the Department of Justice is on the other side of the table. If you once you do bring in an attorney and you have outside counsel come in, there are many different things that they can do for you. They can, first of all, act as a buffer and communicate with the government on your behalf without the risk that the things that your lawyer says can be directly attributed to you as incriminating statements. They can contact the government lawyer and get information about the investigation. They can find out what they can about the allegations that are being alleged. Sometimes the prosecutors or the False Claims Act attorneys on the other side of the table will tell you a lot, and sometimes they won't tell you very much at all. It really varies from case to case. They can also tell you what your status is. Are you a mere witness? Are you a target? They can negotiate reasonable deadlines for document production. So if you get one of those CID requests for documents and it's very overburdensome and they want it all in a week, your lawyer can call and say, you know what, here are the things that I can give you right now, but there's some things that you're asking for that's going to take months to put together. It's really unreasonable. Let's figure out how to establish reasonable limits to this. So that's another job that your outside attorney can handle for you. And they can also direct any internal investigations that you decide to conduct in parallel with the government investigation so that you can find out what's going on in your own company. It can do that under a stronger privilege than in-house attorneys will have. And one example I like to pull out for folks is that if you are in the United States, there's a fairly, I think, relatively in this country, strong privilege, attorney-client privilege that applies to in-house legal communications when it's clear that the in-house lawyer is providing legal advice and not providing business advice. Sometimes that's not entirely clear, and that's why the outside attorney privilege can be stronger. But if the investigation actually has global reach, if it's a foreign corrupt practices investigation or something that reaches outside the United States, then you may have really serious problems trying to claim privilege as an in-house attorney, because in many countries, the attorney-client privilege is not applicable to in-house lawyers. And so in those circumstances, it really is extremely important that you hire an outside lawyer to handle your investigation for you. Next slide. So the next thing that you need to do immediately is lock down your documents. You got to do that as soon as possible. Since medical device and pharma companies are such highly regulated businesses, I think most of you probably already have sophisticated document retention policies in place, but not everything is going to be captured by that. You need to work with your IT team to turn off any routine document deletion programs you might have. Many companies have a robot that comes in and just deletes stuff after 2 years. You're going to want to turn that off as to any documents or emails that might be within the scope of the investigation. You should try to capture everything that's potentially relevant on central servers. And if you have the capacity to execute a silent litigation hold, where you just capture and freeze frame the documents and emails that are on the server at the time that you find out about the investigation, you should do that. You should also work with your outside counsel to draft and distribute a document hold notice or document preservation notice, and make sure that gets distributed to employees with potentially relevant information as quickly as possible. And if you're concerned that you might have an employee who is implicated and that employee might destroy evidence, you should think about and seriously consider putting that individual on administrative leave and taking possession of any of their company issued computers or cell phones immediately. The government is very good at examining computers and figuring out when significant information has been deleted in response to an investigation. It's the kind of thing that can actually turn what started out as a false claims investigation into a criminal one. I'm aware of at least one device company that had to deal with this issue where they had a false claims investigation going on. One of their employees intentionally destroyed a whole bunch of documents and records that were directly relevant to the government's investigation. The government found out about it. The company ultimately got criminally charged, and the fact that those documents were destroyed was one of the government's, key exhibits in the criminal trial. Just understand that the DOJ sees hiding evidence and destroying documents as an indicator of guilt. So you want to take every step you can to prevent that from happening, either intentionally or unintentionally, because even unintentional deletions can be misinterpreted by the government as intentional ones. Next slide. Okay, so now you've managed to get through the first few days, you've retained an attorney, and you've locked down your documents. What's next? Next slide. First of all, develop a communication plan. Be thoughtful about how you're communicating about the case. First of all, notify upper management. That's going to be a tough discussion to have. Often the feedback that you get is, well, let's get this wrapped up. I want this over with in a couple of months. And how much is this going to cost? This kind of investigation can be extremely disruptive. It can be extremely expensive. And most of these investigations will go on for years, not months. Upper management needs to be counseled on that and their expectations set. You also should develop a strategy for notifying your employees. And this varies from case to case and from company to company, what that strategy should be. Some places and with some investigations, it makes the most sense to just tell the employees that have a need to know, those who are most likely to receive interview requests or requests for documents that are in their custody or control. In other companies, in other situations, it might make the most sense to send out a blast written statement to the entire workforce. This is often the case with smaller companies and companies that are facing investigations that are likely to end up in the media. It's often not a good thing for your employees to find out that their company is under investigation from the Star Tribune, as opposed to finding out about it from the management of their employer. So consider those factors when you develop your communications plan. Warn your employees who do know about the investigation not to gossip about it. The last thing you want to do is have the information spread via the water cooler. Rumor mills can create bad evidence, and they can create misinformation that causes business disruption and panic. It is important that employees know that if they are talking to other people, either at home or at work, they could actually be creating new evidence and turning those individuals into witnesses in the case. You should also instruct your employees not to talk to the media about the case. If there is a media implication, then it is a good idea and strategy to have a point person within the company who is assigned to handle media inquiries and simply direct all employees to that person. And for any employees who are involved in collecting information or documents on behalf of the company, it is important to let them know about the importance of confidentiality and the attorney-client privilege, and make sure that they're aware that their communications with the company's counsel cannot be shared without potential waiver of that privilege. Next slide. Your communication strategy, if you're dealing with a government investigation that could end up in the press, should have a component that involves managing the media. You should consider retaining a PR firm to assist you if it's something that is likely to have a significant negative media blowback. And you should discuss in advance how you're going to handle media requests. I think most lawyers would advise their clients against giving interviews to reporters while a government investigation is ongoing. On the other hand, no comment responses, if that's all you say, can often be extremely unhelpful and cast a company in a bad light. So you should work together with your PR consultant and also with your outside counsel to figure out how you're going to respond to that. One thing that some folks do will be to take down the media's questions and very carefully consider how they're going to answer those questions and develop kind of well thought out written responses to the questions as an alternative to participating in direct interviews with a reporter. Another thing you might want to consider if you are aware that this is coming down the pike is to get out in front of it, have a conversation with your PR consultant in advance before the media contacts you, and consider having a written statement prepared before the coverage actually hits. Next slide. You also have to consider whether there are any mandatory reporting obligations that apply when you become aware of a government investigation. If you're a public company, obviously, one of the things you have to consider is whether the investigation meets the materiality threshold for triggering SEC disclosure requirements. Have you learned anything that would trigger MDR requirements that have not yet been met? Are you under a government contract, a corporate integrity agreement, an acquisition agreement, some other contract that requires disclosures? Consider all of these things when the government investigation hits the door and make sure that you're not missing any steps. Next slide. I don't need to spend a whole lot of time on this one, but it's just a reminder that if a government investigation comes your way, you should always check your insurance policies and make sure that you notify your insurer about the investigation in time so that you don't miss the triggering event for coverage and you don't blow the deadlines and lose your insurance coverage because you haven't notified them about what's going on soon enough. Next slide. Next, consider, depending on the circumstances, and it's not always the case that you know enough to be able to launch your own parallel investigation or might not want to, but in many cases, it is a good idea to conduct your own parallel investigation so that you can learn what the facts are within your company that the government might be investigating. I always start by investigating the investigation itself and gathering as much information as I can from whatever sources are available to try to find out what the government actually is getting at. Your attorney, first of all, should talk to the government's attorney and ask as many questions as possible. Sometimes, as I said before, you can get a lot of information that way. Sometimes you don't come up with a whole lot because they're playing their cards fairly close to the best, but do the best you can. You can also find out a lot from court record searches and internet searches about related cases or parties. Always look on PACER, which is the sort of the federal government court case system, to see if there's anything related online if you're aware of other individuals or companies who might be involved. Communicate with your employees, find out what they know, and ask them to let you know if they get contacted for interviews. And then if you are aware of other companies or individuals who are involved in the investigation and they're represented, always reach out to their lawyer to find out what their lawyer might know. And then consider conducting your own internal investigation of the facts as well. And Amanda covered a whole bunch of different points for conducting these internal investigations. But I always recommend when there's a government investigation that's ongoing that the investigation be conducted by outside counsel to maximize privilege. Understand that the results of your investigation could potentially end up being disclosed to the government. So there's some risk there. And, particularly if there has to be a third-party disclosure of the investigation findings, that could end up opening a door that causes the court to say that the investigation results need to be disclosed. So always bear that in mind. Do the most you can to maximize privilege in conducting that investigation. Mark everything you should, give your upjohn warnings as appropriate, et cetera. But it's really often a good idea to conduct your own investigation because that is the big thing that's going to help guide your litigation strategy and help you marshal your defenses. Next slide. If your company is under investigation, you're likely to be dealing with requests for interviews of your employees at some point. As I said before, it is the employee's decision whether to participate or not, but you can ask your employees to let you know if they are contacted. And if that happens, one of the first questions that you're going to have to consider is whether to retain an attorney to represent them individually or not. In the criminal defense world, we can't represent more than one party to a targeted criminal investigation. And so that means that the same lawyer cannot represent the company and its employees, and there has to be separate counsel retained if individual representation is needed. This can be really expensive, but in some states, and in Minnesota is one of them, advance payment of legal fees may actually be required under state law, depending on whether the employee acted in good faith and thought they were acting in the best interests of the company at the time that they engaged in the behavior that is being investigated. If you do end up retaining an individual attorney to represent your employees, you can ask the employees to sign what's called an undertaking or a statement in which they would commit to repaying those fees if it turns out that they actually did not act in good faith, that they were a rogue, bad employee actor. But the reality is, even if you have them sign this undertaking type of document, the likelihood that you're going to get those fees recovered is pretty low. Often a good strategy, though, to have them sign it to make sure that they're aware of their obligation to repay and that they're understanding that. Most importantly, though, I think one reason to hire outside counsel for your individual employees is that they're better able to defend themselves if they're represented. They're better going to know what their rights are, when they can talk, when they should talk, when they shouldn't talk. And that is often going to be in the company's common interest with the employees. Another thing that we have to consider is whether to enter into a joint defense agreement with the counsel for the employee. And that's another seminar that I could give on that. There's a common interest that sometimes applies that allows you to keep your communications with counsel for the employee's counsel protected from disclosure. Now, there's a recent Minnesota Court of Appeals decision that came down in June of this year that held that there is no common interest privilege in Minnesota. That case is currently being challenged in the Minnesota Supreme Court. So I think there's going to be another chapter written on that. But most of the time in federal court, the common interest privilege is recognized. Next slide. See that I'm running out of time, so I'm going to handle this quickly. Remediation is a consideration that is highly fact specific. It's something that you should consider if you have facts that you uncover in connection with your response to the government investigation. But it's also something that has some risks to it. Changing your policies and practices may be viewed by prosecutors as an admission of guilt, and you need to weigh the benefits and against the risks of remediating. In some cases, you don't have a choice. If your device is killing patients, you have to issue a recall. If you've overbilled Medicare, not refunding is going to be a separate violation of the False Claims Act. You have to do something to remediate that. On the other hand, if you truly have not done anything wrong, then changing your policies in an attempt to remediate something that wasn't wrong in the first place could send the wrong message. So this is something that needs to be carefully thought out and considered before you make any changes. Next slide. And finally, don't panic. Whatever you do, try to stay calm. I've been through many of these investigations and seen everything from indictments to acquittals to the government just walking away. Anything can happen, but it is critically important for you to keep your head and make thoughtful, rational decisions, because you're going to have a long road ahead of you, and you'll need to be able to get through it with the most carefully thought out approaches available. Next slide. Thank you for your time. I see that I'm out of time. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to address those after the session, or you can send me an email.
Great, thanks, Dulcie. All right, so we have one last presentation for you today. So Amanda Johnston from Gardner Law joins us again, this time joined by Ann Miller from Medtronic. Just an FYI, there are no slides for this presentation, so we're just going to jump into introductions. Ann is a senior principal legal counsel at Medtronic, where she's a member of the Enterprise Legal Regulatory Team. Her practice focuses on FDA regulatory requirements, and she advises the company on quality system issues, FDA inspections, and responses to 483s and warning letters. Amanda, we've already introduced you earlier today, so I'm going to hand things off to you to kick off this final session.
All right, great. Thanks, Mary. And thanks, Anne, for joining us. Really appreciate the time. And we'll have a little bit of a coffee chat today to talk a little bit about FDA. The title of the program is FDA Enforcement Action, I think, discussion. But so in FDA's eyes, recalls, 483s, warning letters, they're not necessarily enforcement actions, but they do feel like enforcement actions when you're on the receiving end. So just wanted to clarify that, but yeah, we'll get into a little discussion, and feel free to jump in if you have any comments to Anne or redirect questions. So you have extensive experience working with FDA, working at FDA. What are just some high level kind of best practices, tips when a company is interacting with FDA on one of these, not necessarily enforcement activities, but like a recall, a 483, a warning letter, anything where they're asking you for information and you're having to react?
Sure. So I think there are three important things. The first one that I'll mention is transparency. When you're speaking with FDA, whether it's in a meeting discussing a recent recall, or you're writing to FDA responding to a 483, which for those who maybe aren't familiar, that's when FDA does an inspection of your facility and they find issues, that's the report that you get. So it's basically saying, here are the things that we think are problematic. And you have 15 days to respond to that. Be transparent, present the facts, state what you know. I know it seems obvious, but state what you know, and then also be clear about what you're still looking into. If you're still investigating something, be clear about that. You don't want to give FDA the impression that the status of an issue is something other than what it is. So be really clear about that, and be clear about what you know at the time. The last thing you want to do is give FDA the false impression about what the current status of the situation is. And FDA knows that issues evolve and that your understanding of issues can change over time. So don't assume that because you are being transparent about something that you're locked into that forever. Just be really clear about what you know and what you don't know. Now, that said, it doesn't mean you air all of your dirty laundry and make all kinds of admissions when you're having these conversations. It's a balance, but this is also where lawyers for companies or outside counsel can really help advise on words and strategies. So if you are advising a client, for instance, on some of these communications, you can help them strike the balance of being clear and transparent, but not saying too much and making some unnecessary admissions too early in the process. The second thing, and I'm seeing this a lot more, clear patient focus. FDA's role is to protect the public health, and they take that role very seriously. So when you're discussing with an issue with the FDA, even if it's a technical issue about a manufacturing process design, and you're maybe into some of the engineering or you're considering about, things, how, coming down the road, some challenges that are going to be presented to the company because of the action you might be taking. Always keep in mind the patient when you're communicating with FDA, whether it's in writing or in a meeting.
Sure.
Consider the perspective of the patient, because that's often where FDA's mind is. How would the patient benefit from what you're talking about? What mitigations are you taking to reduce risk? FDA's questions and approaches when communicating with you are often driven by patient safety and reducing risk. And the last thing, I think that some people forget about this, and having been on the inside of the agency for a few years, it's important to understand where FDA's motivations are and their challenges. So when you're meeting with FDA, you sometimes think that it's their big issue. It's one of the most important things they're thinking about. You are not their only stakeholder. You are one of thousands. They regulate everyone, and they actually try to do a pretty even job as best they can, even though sometimes, you may think that what they're doing is unreasonable or unfair. Remember that they're regulating other companies, and they have information about other decisions that you don't have. They also have a lot of external stakeholders that are making demands on their priorities and their interests as well, including the Department of Health and Human Services. The FDA is within that department. They can sometimes influence or set agendas for FDA. The White House, Congress, the typical Washington influences are there. And then also we're seeing this more recently, investigative journalists. They're investigating FDA decisions. They're publishing articles that, have a slant sometimes about FDA decisions. And I think that can, not motivate FDA, but they're certainly keeping that in mind when they're making decisions about how often and how kind of openly they're communicating publicly about certain things. And then just with all of this, if you're advising a client or working with a client, or if you're working in-house, even if it's just a run-of-the-mill 43, or if it does escalate to something like a warning letter, and you are having periodic meetings, for instance, with FDA. If you're in-house, it's okay to join those meetings. I think there's a misconception sometimes that if you bring a lawyer to a meeting, especially if it's in my role, I'm a regulatory lawyer, so it's kind of what I do. I haven't found in my experience that joining a call or being introduced as in-house counsel for the company escalates the conversation. So, it is a balance, but I think it's okay to be at the table. You hear things differently sometimes, and you can also, advise the client a little bit better when you're hearing things firsthand.
Yeah, absolutely. Have you ever had a situation where you joined the call and then FDA said, oh, wait, do we need to get our lawyer involved? Or I'm just curious if that's ever happened.
Never.
Okay.
Yeah, never. No, I'm not saying it, there might be some situations where that would happen, but I do think there would be a difference perhaps if you brought your outside counsel.
Yeah.
That may send a message, but I've never had that happen in my experience.
Okay, great. So yeah, we talked a little bit kind of about what you keep in mind when you're responding or have a situation where you're responding to an FDA action. When you have, this is kind of a clarifying question, but when you get like a 483, for example, what does the response process look like? Is it, who's writing it? Is it, because typically quality would see that as kind of their job to respond, but is it a team approach? Is it quality and then legal, or how do you kind of work through those responses? Or what would you suggest, I guess?
Yeah, so I think that, depends on the company. I'm sure there are companies where quality is always done it, or regulatory, and that's what they continue to do. I do a lot of the work. I think the process is typically, getting involved early on so that you can understand what the finding is really about, because sometimes what's on the paper isn't necessarily clear, what the underlying issue is. So get involved early, ask a lot of questions. You might have to do some coaching, I guess, about don't defend this. I mean, we try to defend it in the inspection, so now is not the time to push back. My experience is that doesn't work well. So you kind of work with them on how to structure the response so that you're presenting the facts, maybe presenting some context about what happened, but helping them then develop some meaningful actions to respond.
Right. Okay.
And writing. So taking the content that they give and then putting it together.
Right. Got it. Okay. Thank you. And kind of on the topic of 43s, with COVID over the last, almost 2 years now, we've seen kind of a pause on in-person inspections. And now it sounds like they have resumed based on risk areas and industry. Do you have any thoughts or comments on kind of how inspections are going, or, what have you seen, or what kind of trends do you see coming in the future?
Sure. Well, FDA, I saw kind of a brief uptick last spring when vaccines were rolling out and the rates were kind of dropping, kind of late spring. There was a little bit of a ramp up in inspections, but with the Delta variant, it's pulled back quite a bit. So they're still operating under their risk-based approach, where they'll look at the rates in a particular area. And if it's at a certain level, they won't inspect unless it's mission critical, as they call it. So that's still out there. I think that they still are doing some on-site inspections. The biggest thing that I think we'll see as we move out of this latest surge and hopefully not into another one, is that FDA will pursue a risk-based approach. I mean, they have a backlog, so they're going to prioritize. And if it's, a mission critical, how they term it, COVID related, usually, they will continue to do those inspections, but we're also seeing follow-up inspections to Class 1 recalls prioritized. Okay. So if your company has a recent Class 1 recall and FDA has not done a follow-up inspection, I would expect that you might be on a short list. So just be prepared for that. And these are, a particular interest for lawyers, because the Class 1 recall itself can raise legal issues, whether it's a threat of litigation or government inquiries. And then you tack on the inspection, which has the potential of disclosing underlying issues related to your quality system. So I would really focus on those and making sure you're prepared. I think the other thing we're seeing is that because of kind of previous changes to, especially the Center for Devices, they're more expert. They're focusing pharma inspections are pharma investigators and device investigators. So they're more specialized and they're more technically smart than maybe in previous years. So the inspections are a little bit more rigorous. And I think that trend will continue. I think also as they get through the backlog, you might see them a little bit shorter and focused. So they're going to go in and they're just going to hit their things, and they might, you might get a 43 and then they're going to move on. And I think that with that expertise, they also are better at looking more broadly across the quality system too. So if they identify an issue in one part, like let's say if it's a recall inspection, they may start looking at your manufacturing or whether there was a design issue or a development issue, and then they're going to carry that thread all the way across and find multiple issues for something that feels, at least to you, like it's just one thing.
Right. So more focused and probably more efficient from their perspective. Are you seeing any alternative methods for inspection? I know there was some talk about kind of virtual inspections. Has that gone anywhere? Have you see any trends coming that could
Yeah, there was some talk about that last winter. I think when we were sort of in the depths of COVID, and trying to talk about ways to do remote inspections. In the device area, there are notified bodies, the European model to have the notified bodies do the inspections. They've done a really good job of jumping into remote inspections. They use Zoom, they use SharePoints. So they were able to do some coverage throughout COVID when FDA was not. FDA consistently said that they don't have regulatory authority to do remote inspections. So I don't see that changing. I think we've probably passed that point where it felt like an urgent need to do something more of an alternative approach. They, at least the CDRH side, they did start a pilot for remote inspections. And I haven't heard anything about that since it started. So I don't know how that's going or whether that got any legs. So I think that, again, it'll just depend on where the rates are. I would anticipate that the thing we'll see mostly is on-site, more targeted focused on-site inspections versus spending their time trying to develop a new program.
Right. And probably shorter inspection periods. I mean, rather than having them visit for weeks at a time.
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I think if there are, as the inspections start, we may start to see some warning letters too that follow some of these. Yeah. And, then the follow-up inspections. I think if there are concerns about, a company already under warning letter, they're going to probably stay as long as they think they need to. But generally speaking, the initial coverage, I think they'll be more focused.
Okay. What about routine QSIT audits? Are those kind of gone for now, or are they just going to be focusing on issues, risk-based?
That's what I'm seeing, unless they tack it on.
Sure.
So if they are doing a for-cause inspection, for instance, following a recall, they may do some QSIT work there,
Sure.
especially if that site is overdue, if they haven't had a full QSIT or
Right.
level 2 or level 1 for a while.
Okay. Interesting. So we've talked a little bit about recalls. I'm just curious. I think we've seen a little bit of an uptick in class 1 recalls. So, some potentially could have been a class 2, but were, classified by FDA as class 1. Do you see that as a trend, or do you have any comments or observations on that?
Yeah, well, we're definitely seeing that in the device space. I'd say over the past 6 months, where we're seeing more class 1 recalls, many of them with no or very few adverse events involved. So I think that there are a couple of things behind that, but one is that FDA is integrating more medical and technical input into recall decisions. I mean, this is a kind of a function of the reorganization that they did in the device side. That they have medical review looking very strictly at the patient impact. And so with that, they're looking at risk more strictly. And, the theme that I'm seeing is they're not waiting for a patient impact to be realized before classifying something as a class 1 if there's a potential for patient harm. So if you're taking a recall and the severity of risk is high, FDA may classify it as a class 1, even if the rate of occurrence is very low. They'll assess the potential and not wait for the harm to actually occur before considering it a class 1. Now, I want to be careful not to suggest that the recall decisions that need to be made should be made. Sure. And, you might anticipate that if there is a patient harm involved, that just be prepared that something that may have been classified as a class 2, maybe a year or 2 ago, may ramp up to a class 1. The other thing that we are seeing, or I'm seeing, is this concept of residual risk. So I think there's a factor when, you reduce the risk in the marketplace. So how much residual risk is left after you take the the field action or take the recall. So for instance, if you initiate a recall and you send a Dear Doctor letter, HCP letter, but don't remove the device, there's FDA may view that as some risk left in the marketplace.
Yeah.
Or if you implement a change to a product and you do a rolling change going forward, but you decide not to replace. All of that goes into FDA's decision about how much risk is associated collectively with the recall you're taking.
Okay. Yeah, some parallels with like the Aleer case that Mark and Dulcie mentioned earlier, and the St. Jude case, where they had an issue, took a recall, but then it ended up being prosecuted under the False Claims Act. So is there any changes that companies should be making when they're thinking about whether they need to take recall action, just because of the kind of more conservative stance? But if a company's deciding, is this a recall, are there any kind of trends or considerations that you would recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think the similar considerations apply, right? The notion of risk and how much risk. So you should assess, again, patient risk, be real honest with yourself and challenge yourself about whether or not there's patient risk. Things like the recall isn't needed because the patient risk is mitigated because it's something that, let's say it's something used in a surgical procedure, the physician will notice. They'll notice the problem, and so they won't use the device.
Yeah.
Or the user, if it's a patient use home use, the patient will see it. Or, well, if this happens, they can't use it, so they won't hurt themselves. Or, we can replace it right away, or they can call for help. All of those things where you're sort of putting the quality control,
exactly,
on the user. FDA doesn't look kindly on those types of decisions. So you have to really think about, again, the patient focus piece that we talked about earlier. Put yourself in the patient's shoes and the user's shoes. What would they expect to see? What would they want to see? And kind of the human factors involved especially, again, I'm qualifying this, I'm on the device side. It's very different for pharma, but
right.
Yeah. So, if you make the decision not to, again, when the inspections do come around, they're better, they're smarter. If you've made a decision not to take an action, if it does end up on a 43, that's an unfortunate issue to have to deal with later.
Right. Exactly. Okay. And you mentioned the reorganization of CDRH and kind of how they've now consolidated their pre-market, post-market. They're looking at the whole product life cycle, which makes sense. Have you seen or do you have any observations on the pre-market side when it comes to like change supplements or device changes?
Yeah, I think that definitely. I mean, we think about the, sort of the medical expertise, the pre-market lens from FDA on the post-market side when they're looking at recalls. But I've seen the flip of that too, where during, let's say, a pre-market review session, there might be input from the compliance side. So what the Center for Devices did a few years ago was they reorged. They used to have pre-market, ODE, they called it Office of Device Evaluation divided by types of devices. And then they had this big Office of Compliance, and Office of Compliance worked all across. Well, now they've blown up the Office of Compliance, and you have compliance experts, so kind of post-market inspection experts that are tied in with the different products. So the offices have a compliance function within each product family. So what we're seeing then is more integration with compliance questions and the regulatory pre-market side. So if, for instance, you're reviewing a submission, you might get questions about, let's say it's a change to your product, it's a design change. And you might get questions about whether you plan to notify users. It's like something that's going to reduce risk. What's your recall strategy? Are you going to replace what's already out there or rolling change? You might get questions about complaint rates. What do you expect for the complaint rate? Do you expect it to go down after you replace this device? questions about specific MDRs that FDA is seeing. So you might see your pre-market folks who are on those calls might receive those questions. And I think it's just important to know that that's a possibility and to not get blindsided by those. Seek input within your organization before you talk to them. In some companies, like the quality and regulatory sides, those different functions, which we sort of have historically divided as pre and post-market, they may be different. In a smaller company, they may be integrated, so you're always talking, but in a larger organization, you might not necessarily share information. And I think going forward, it's really important that your quality and regulatory kind of are almost lockstep when it comes to these things, that your quality folks know what submissions are going in and what they're saying, and that conversely, you don't want a submission to go into FDA that makes a clear statement about what your complaint rate is, your adverse event rate is, and then it's wrong. Right. And the data was right there all along. If, you know, so you can imagine, it seems obvious, but you can imagine how those issues could come up, especially in a larger organization. So I would say align yourself like FDA is as much as you can, because that's how they are looking at things. And it's important that you know, regulated industry do the same thing.
Yeah. No, that's a really good point. I mean, being in regulatory at a large organization previously, I could see easily how it could get siloed. But yeah, like design changes, anything related to field actions or recalls or MDRs, or the reason for the change is important. So that's good advice.
Right. And I would extend that to even to, you know, 43s.
Yeah.
You know, we talked about kind of sometimes if the lawyer gets involved and writes, you know, you want to make sure that you've got all of your stakeholders, if the 43 is big enough, involved, so that you're really challenging yourself about the commitments, demonstrating a commitment to fixing the issues, helping you write specific, clear responses. And then also, you know, sometimes I think that other organizations can bring a balance in tone, because it's another thing to really be mindful of when you're communicating, especially in writing, is to watch your tone. Don't be defensive. And also sometimes watch the advocacy. It's not necessarily the right time to be an advocate. I know that's difficult for lawyers. But my approach is to use factual and balanced, and almost, actually, I've been told my writing is dispassionate, which I took as a compliment.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. Sometimes that's good.
In this context, it is.
Yes, exactly. Well, good. Well, we are at time. So, Anne, I want to thank you so much for your time today. Really appreciate it. I think you provided some great insights for everybody watching. Mary?
Yes, thank you so much. Just a few housekeeping items for cleaning up. First and foremost, thank you to all the presenters today. And we so appreciate your time and insight and staying on schedule. That was probably the most on schedule CLE I've ever participated in. Second, these slides will be available, as well as the CLE information for those who want credit. They'll be emailed out to those who registered a few days from now. Again, if you have any questions that didn't get answered today or want more information, you're welcome to reach out to Dulcie Foster or Mark Gardner, and their information is at the beginning of the presentation on those slides that will be emailed out. Otherwise, our one last ask, do complete our program evaluation. It helps us put on programming and CLEs that you actually want to spend 4 hours watching. So take a few minutes, click the link provided, and otherwise we thank you for your time. Have a great day.